In a city once echoing with the cheers of Nazi rallies, the world's most notorious men would face a courtroom that would condemn history itself. Nuremberg, once a proud Nazi stronghold where Hitler's rallies had drawn oceans of fanatics, was chosen to host a reckoning unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Here, inside a bomb-scarred city still choking on the dust of war, the victors gathered to hold the vanquished accountable. In November 1945, under the cold glare of cameras and the watchful eyes of history, 22 of the most infamous men in the world stood accused architects of genocide, ministers of propaganda, industrial overlords, and generals who had once commanded millions. Their crimes were not just against nations but against humanity itself: mass murder, enslavement, torture, and the deliberate attempt to erase entire peoples from existence. The world had never seen a trial like this. For the first time, leaders of a defeated regime would not simply be executed or exiled, but instead forced to face evidence, testimony, and their victims' voices inside a courtroom. The prosecution came armed with mountains of proof, films of concentration camps, piles of documents signed in ink that sent millions to their deaths, and testimonies from survivors who bore the scars of starvation, whips, and gas chambers. The defendants, once untouchable and feared, now sat inside a dock like common criminals, guarded by soldiers from the very nations they had sworn to destroy. Their faces, Goering's arrogance, Hess's silence, Ribbentrop's denial, were broadcast across the globe, symbols of evil brought to judgment. But the Nuremberg Trials were not only about punishment, they were about invention. Out of the rubble of war came new ideas that still shape our world today: crimes against humanity, genocide, and the principle that following orders is no defense for atrocity. Judges from 4 Allied powers, America, Britain, the Soviet Union, and France, sat together, an uneasy alliance forged in victory, yet divided by politics, ideology, and mistrust. Every word spoken in courtroom, 600 of the Palace of Justice carried the weight of history, echoing far beyond its walls. This was not merely a trial of men, but a trial of ideas: the idea that power is absolute, that propaganda can bend truth into lies, that human beings can be treated as disposable. The Nuremberg courtroom became the crucible where these ideas were destroyed, replaced by the fragile promise of international law. Yet it was no simple path. Defendants mocked the court, witnesses broke down under the burden of memory, and the world asked whether true justice was even possible for crimes so vast and inhuman. The images from Nuremberg became iconic: rows of Nazi leaders with headphones clamped to their ears, translators whispering across languages, prosecutors raising their voices as reels of film flickered in the darkened chamber. Millions of viewers would watch, reading newspapers that printed the words "Never Again," even as the Cold War already loomed on the horizon. This is the story of the Nuremberg Trials, a story of vengeance and justice, of memory and denial, of a world grappling with the meaning of humanity itself in the aftermath of its darkest hour. From the shattered streets of Nuremberg to the birth of international law, this is the trial that changed history forever. So close your eyes, let the echoes of the courtroom fill your mind, and drift with us into the haunting record of a moment when the world tried for the first time to make sense of evil. And before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is there, because across time zones and generations, together we carry history forward. The guns of World War II fell silent in May 1945, but what remained across Europe was a continent in ruins, scarred by the most devastating conflict in human history. Entire cities lay flattened by relentless bombing campaigns, their streets reduced to twisted steel and rubble where families once lived. The human toll was staggering: Tens of millions dead, millions more displaced, and survivors wandering through landscapes they no longer recognized. Germany itself had become a wasteland of hunger and destruction, occupied by the victorious Allies who now faced the monumental task of rebuilding. In the East, the Soviet Union counted its dead in the tens of millions, while its cities smoldered under the weight of unimaginable sacrifice. Western Europe too bore deep wounds, France scarred by occupation, Britain battered by the Blitz, and Italy torn apart by civil war and invasion. Across the continent, transportation networks lay shattered, food supplies collapsed, and disease threatened to claim even more lives in the fragile aftermath of war. The psychological devastation was no less profound, as survivors grappled with the memory of atrocities that defied comprehension. Yet amid the chaos, one question echoed louder than all others: how could justice be served for crimes so vast in scale and so monstrous in nature? From the ashes of war emerged not only a demand for peace, but a cry for accountability unlike anything the world had ever known. As Allied soldiers pushed into the heart of Germany during the final months of the war, they uncovered evidence of crimes that surpassed even the darkest propaganda. In the forests of Poland, in the fields of Ukraine, and in the towns of Germany itself, mass graves revealed the systematic murder of innocents. But it was in the liberation of the concentration camps that the true horror became undeniable. At Buchenwald, emaciated survivors stumbled toward their liberators, their skeletal forms a living testament to years of starvation and abuse. In Dachau, piles of corpses were stacked like firewood, the victims of neglect, disease, and deliberate extermination. The world was stunned by what was discovered at Bergen-Belsen, where tens of thousands of bodies lay unburied as typhus raged through the camp. Then came Auschwitz, the epicenter of the Holocaust, where gas chambers and crematoria revealed an industrial process of annihilation. For the first time, soldiers, journalists, and officials confronted the sheer scale of Nazi brutality with their own eyes. These discoveries obliterated any lingering illusions about the nature of Hitler's regime and forced the Allies to confront the question of how to respond. The crimes were not abstract. They were written into the earth, into the faces of survivors, and into the silent gaze of the dead. The demand for justice was not merely a moral impulse, but a political necessity in the fragile post-war landscape. Without accountability, the danger of revenge and cycles of violence loomed large across a devastated Europe. The atrocities committed by the Nazis were not only against nations, but against humanity itself, transcending borders and demanding a collective response. Leaders in Washington, London, Moscow, and Paris understood that the fate of the post-war order depended on how they addressed these crimes. To let them pass unpunished would risk normalizing atrocities of such scale, inviting future tyrants to follow the same path. At the same time, the Allies grappled with their own divisions. The Soviet Union pushed for harsh retribution, Britain considered summary executions, and the United States advocated for trials under the rule of law. The world was entering uncharted territory, for never before had leaders of a defeated nation been put on trial by an international tribunal. The sheer scope of Nazi criminality, wars of aggression, genocide, exploitation, demanded an unprecedented response. This was not to be a simple reckoning with individuals, but a test of civilization itself. The survivors, the victims, and the generations yet to come all awaited the verdict of history. Yet in the early summer of 1945, the world was not united in clarity, but fractured in grief, hunger, and political calculation. Millions of refugees crisscrossed Europe, searching for homes that no longer existed. The displaced persons camps filled with Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, and others who had been uprooted by forced labor, deportations, and war. Entire populations were on the move, while Allied armies struggled to maintain order in shattered Germany. At the same time, civilians demanded justice not only for themselves, but for loved ones who had vanished into the machinery of the Nazi state. In France, families mourned those executed during the occupation. In the Soviet Union, villages counted their dead by the hundreds. The sheer magnitude of loss meant that for many the idea of justice seemed both essential and impossible. Could any court sentence equal the destruction of 6 million Jews, the slaughter of millions of Soviet citizens, or the devastation of an entire continent? And yet the very scale of these crimes made silence intolerable. If civilization itself was to survive, the Allies needed to create a new form of justice, something that had never been attempted before. The decision to hold trials was not immediate, for the Allies themselves were deeply divided on the question of how to deal with the defeated Nazi leadership. Winston Churchill, wary of prolonged proceedings, initially favored summary executions of top officials, fearing trials would turn into propaganda stages. Joseph Stalin, driven by his own brutal sense of justice, had similar inclinations, advocating the swift punishment of Nazi leaders without delay. Franklin Roosevelt and later Harry Truman, however, pushed for a trial that would set an example for future generations, a legal reckoning rooted in evidence, not vengeance. Out of these debates emerged the recognition that this was not merely about Germany, but about creating a foundation for international law. For the first time, crimes would be judged not only as violations against nations, but as crimes against humanity itself. In this way, the Nuremberg Trials would mark the beginning of a new moral order in global affairs. It was a turning point where civilization sought to assert the primacy of justice over sheer power. The tribunal would not erase the suffering, but it would at least attempt to give meaning to the dead by speaking their truth in a court of law. The choice of Nuremberg as the site of the trials carried both symbolism and practicality. Once a proud medieval city, Nuremberg had been a centerpiece of Nazi propaganda, hosting the massive rallies that showcased Hitler's vision of a 1,000-year Reich. Its fall into ruin after Allied bombing mirrored the collapse of Nazi power itself, a fitting backdrop for justice to be rendered. Moreover, the Palace of Justice had survived relatively intact and contained a large prison capable of housing the defendants. Holding the trials in Germany, rather than in London or Moscow, was also a deliberate statement. Justice would be delivered in the very heart of the defeated Reich. For the survivors and victims, it was a powerful message that the crimes committed under the swastika would now be judged in open court. The site reminded the world that the ideology which once proclaimed its supremacy from Nuremberg's grandstands now faced humiliation in its ruins. It was a powerful stage on which history would turn the page from terror to accountability. The very city that once echoed with chants of Sieg Heil would now resonate with the sober tones of justice. Even as preparations for the trials began, the world confronted a deeper question: could law rise above war, or was this simply vengeance dressed in legal robes? Critics argued that holding the trials risked the appearance of victors' justice, where the winners judged the losers according to their own standards. Yet others insisted that without such trials, the Allies would abandon the chance to establish a precedent for all future wars. For centuries, victors had executed or exiled their enemies, but rarely had they placed them on trial in a court of law. Nuremberg promised something different, a legal record that would document the crimes of the Nazis with undeniable evidence. This was not to be an exercise in retribution, but a blueprint for a new world order. The trial would bring together judges from 4 nations: America, Britain, the Soviet Union, and France, uniting diverse traditions of law for the first time in history. It was a daring experiment, fraught with challenges, but it carried the promise of transforming justice itself. And in the shadow of the Holocaust, silence was not an option. Thus, The world entered the summer of 1945 with ruins at its feet, grief in its heart, and an unprecedented trial on the horizon. The survivors of Auschwitz, Dachau, and countless other camps would soon find their voices carried into the courtroom, their suffering transformed into testimony. The Nazi leaders who once strutted across Europe would sit in the dock, confronted not only by their accusers, but by the very idea of civilization they had tried to destroy. The trials promised to expose, in meticulous detail, the machinery of war, genocide, and conquest that had shattered the world. For the first time in history, humanity sought to judge crimes against humanity, daring to believe that the law could stand even in the face of overwhelming evil. It was a fragile hope, one born of devastation, but determined to endure. As the rubble of cities was cleared, and refugees searched for homes, a courtroom in Nuremberg prepared to confront the darkest chapter in modern history. In that chamber, the past would be laid bare, and the future of justice itself would be tested. Out of the inferno of war, the world was about to witness the birth of something new, an international reckoning for crimes without precedent. Even before the war reached its terrible climax, the question of justice was already haunting the minds of Allied leaders. As early as 1941, reports filtered out of occupied Europe, describing massacres of Jews, shootings of hostages, and the systematic destruction of entire communities. Governments in exile based in London pressed the Allies to acknowledge these crimes publicly, warning that silence would embolden the perpetrators. In December 1942, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union issued a joint declaration condemning the bestial policy of cold-blooded extermination being carried out by Hitler's regime. But words alone could not satisfy the mounting horror. There was a growing recognition that punishment had to follow. The problem, however, was how such punishment could be delivered when no precedent existed. Would Nazi leaders be executed once captured, or would they be subjected to the impartial judgment of a court? At stake was not merely retribution, but the very principle of how civilization responds to mass atrocity. Already, the seeds of Nuremberg were being planted, long before the last battle was fought. The Allies knew that justice must not wait until peace, but must be prepared even as war still raged. The Moscow Declaration of November 1943 marked the first clear signal that the Allies intended to hold Nazi leaders accountable. Meeting in the Soviet capital, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin signed a joint statement declaring that those responsible for atrocities would be brought back to the scene of their crimes and judged on the spot. For crimes committed in specific countries, perpetrators would face justice in the lands where their victims had perished. Yet for those guilty of offences with no particular geographical localization, a higher form of justice would be required, one that transcended national boundaries. This was the first glimmer of the idea of an international tribunal, though its details were vague and contested. For Stalin, the declaration was an opportunity to underline Soviet suffering and to demand vengeance. For Churchill, it was a way to reassure the governments in exile that Britain stood by them. For Roosevelt, it was a carefully balanced promise, meant to hold options open until the war's end. Behind the triumphant rhetoric, however, deep disagreements remained about what justice should actually look like. The Moscow Declaration was a milestone, but it was also a promise still waiting to be defined. Winston Churchill himself remained skeptical of lengthy legal proceedings, which he feared would descend into farce. To him, Hitler and his henchmen were not common criminals but aggressors who had plunged the world into catastrophe, and their guilt was self-evident. Churchill privately argued that the top Nazi leaders should be rounded up and shot within 6 hours of capture, sparing the world endless delays. In his view, a trial risked turning criminals into martyrs, giving them a stage to justify their actions before history. He remembered the aftermath of World War I, when Kaiser Wilhelm had been spared trial and fled into exile in the Netherlands, a humiliation that had left justice unfulfilled. This time Churchill wanted no such evasions. His stance reflected both a visceral hatred of the Nazi regime and a pragmatic desire to move swiftly in the unstable post-war world. Yet his harsh vision clashed with those in Washington, where the idea of due process carried far greater weight. The British leader's instinct for summary execution set him apart, but it also revealed the raw tension between retribution and legality that defined the Allied debates. Joseph Stalin's position, at least publicly, was even harsher than Churchill's. At the 1943 Tehran Conference, the Soviet dictator famously proposed the execution of 50,000 German officers to prevent Germany from rising again. The suggestion was partly theatrical, meant to emphasize the scale of Soviet suffering, but it reflected a deeper truth about Stalin's desire for ruthless punishment. The Soviet Union had endured unspeakable losses, millions dead, cities destroyed, entire regions razed. Stalin's demand for blood was rooted in both vengeance and strategy, aimed at ensuring Germany would never again threaten the Soviet homeland. Yet behind the bluster, Stalin also recognized the propaganda value of a trial. A carefully orchestrated proceeding could both humiliate the Nazis and provide a permanent record of their crimes. The Soviets had their own history of show trials, and Stalin understood the power of public justice, even when manipulated. Thus, while he flirted with the idea of executions, he was not blind to the utility of an international tribunal. His position, like Churchill's, was shaped as much by politics as by morality, revealing just how uncertain the Allies still were about the road ahead. It was in Washington that the idea of a genuine international tribunal found its strongest champion. American officials, led by Secretary of War Henry Stimson and his protege John J. McCloy, argued that summary executions would betray the very principles the Allies claimed to defend. For them, trials were not only about punishing the guilty, but about establishing the rule of law as a cornerstone of the post-war world. The United States, with its constitutional traditions and faith in judicial process, insisted that the evidence of Nazi crimes should be presented openly before the eyes of the world. A court would expose the full extent of the atrocities, preventing denials and distortions for generations to come. Moreover, trials would demonstrate that the Allies did not simply mimic the brutality of their enemies, but sought to uphold higher ideals. This vision was shared by figures such as Justice Robert H. Jackson, who would later become the chief U.S. prosecutor at Nuremberg. For Jackson, the tribunal was not only about punishing individuals, but about setting an enduring precedent. America's push for legality would ultimately shape the course of history. These debates were not merely abstract arguments in diplomatic salons, but hard-fought battles of ideology, power, and practicality. Churchill's desire for swift executions clashed with Roosevelt's cautious support for trials, while Stalin oscillated between vengeance and spectacle. The smaller Allied governments, from Poland to Czechoslovakia, lobbied furiously for justice on their own soil, demanding that crimes against their people be acknowledged in open court. Meanwhile, legal scholars across the world began to sketch out the foundations of what such trials might look like. Concepts like crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity emerged in these years, shaping the eventual framework of the tribunal. The debates revealed the profound difficulty of creating justice after a conflict so vast and unprecedented. Each leader sought to balance morality with expediency, principle with politics. The idea of an international tribunal was fragile, contested, and often doubted. Yet, as the war drew to its close, momentum slowly shifted toward a legal reckoning that would astonish the world. By 1944, The Allied position had begun to crystallize, though not without lingering disputes. The British reluctantly moved away from executions as public opinion grew more supportive of trials. The Soviets, while still suspicious of Western legalism, recognized the propaganda power of a dramatic courtroom setting. The Americans, meanwhile, pressed ahead with detailed planning, drafting charters that would govern an international court of unprecedented authority. The idea of a tribunal was no longer a vague promise but a concrete project under active development. Diplomatic negotiations intensified as lawyers, soldiers, and politicians debated every clause and definition. Could aggressive war itself be labeled a crime? Could leaders be held accountable for the actions of entire states? These questions sparked fierce argument, but progress continued. The Allies were not only preparing to defeat Germany militarily, but to put its leaders on trial for the world to see. In doing so, they laid the foundations of what would become the Nuremberg Trials. Thus, as 1945 approached, the path toward justice was set, though not yet fully clear. The Moscow Declaration had established the principle, the Allied debates had refined the options, and American insistence on legality had tipped the balance toward a tribunal. The world was preparing for a trial unlike anything in history, one that would expose, in court, the crimes of a regime that had sought to enslave continents and annihilate entire peoples. The tension between vengeance and law, between politics and morality, had not disappeared, but it had been channeled into a daring experiment. For the first time, international justice was being imagined not as an abstract ideal, but as a practical reality. The leaders who had unleashed war and genocide would face judgment not at the point of a rifle, but before the bar of law. It was an extraordinary shift, born of suffering and necessity, and it would define the legacy of the post-war world. The road to Nuremberg was now open, and history was moving inexorably toward the greatest trial the world had ever seen. The war was ending, and with it came the urgent need to transform Allied promises into a concrete plan for justice. Germany was collapsing, Allied troops were sweeping across its ruined cities, and captured Nazi leaders were beginning to fall into their hands. It was no longer enough to issue declarations. Now the victors had to decide exactly how to try the men who had brought the world to the brink of annihilation. In this atmosphere of urgency and anticipation, representatives from the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and later France gathered in London during the summer of 1945. Their mission was monumental: to design an international tribunal that could prosecute the highest-ranking Nazis for crimes never before defined in law. The task was daunting, for there was no precedent for trying a state's leadership in a joint court of nations. Yet the Allies were determined that this war would not end like the last one, with criminals escaping or vanishing into exile. Justice had to be delivered in a way that would withstand the scrutiny of history. And so, in London, one of the boldest legal experiments in human history began to take form. At the heart of these deliberations was the London Charter, a document that would define the structure, scope, and rules of the tribunal. The Charter established the legal foundation of the International Military Tribunal, or IMT, and carefully spelled out how the trials would be conducted. The four major powers, America, Britain, the Soviet Union, and France, each contributed delegates, prosecutors, and legal experts to craft its terms. Every word was debated, for this was not merely a legal text, but a blueprint for global justice. The Charter declared that certain acts committed in the name of the Nazi regime constituted crimes against humanity itself. It also defined the categories of crimes for which individuals could be tried, breaking new ground in international law. For the first time, leaders would not be immune from punishment simply because they acted under the authority of a state. This principle shattered centuries of tradition, and placed personal responsibility above political power. The London Charter was both revolutionary and controversial, but it was the only way to ensure that the world's most powerful criminals could not hide behind flags or offices. The Charter defined three major categories of crimes: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Crimes against peace referred to the planning, initiation, or waging of aggressive war, a radical concept that criminalized the act of unleashing global conflict. War crimes were defined as violations of the long-established laws and customs of war, including the killing of prisoners, targeting civilians, and destruction without military necessity. Crimes against humanity, however, represented the boldest and most far-reaching innovation of all. This category encompassed murder, enslavement, deportation, and extermination carried out against civilian populations, even when those acts were committed within a nation's own borders. In other words, what the Nazis had done to their own citizens, the Jews, the Roma, the disabled, was now subject to international judgment. The legal revolution was profound. Sovereignty was no longer an impenetrable shield for governments that slaughtered their people. The Charter's categories would become the moral pillars of Nuremberg, ensuring that justice encompassed both the waging of war and the atrocities that accompanied it. For the first time in history, humanity itself was placed on the scales of law. Agreeing on these categories was no simple matter, and the negotiations in London were fraught with conflict. The Americans, led by Justice Robert H. Jackson, pressed for a tribunal that emphasized legality, procedure, and the careful presentation of evidence. The British sought balance, wary of creating a trial so complex that it would collapse under its own weight. The Soviets demanded that the process remain political as well as legal, ensuring that the immense suffering of their people was at the forefront. The French, joining later, insisted that their voice be heard as one of the victors, despite their nation's earlier occupation. Disputes erupted over how much power the judges should hold, how evidence should be admitted, and whether the trials would be seen as impartial or as a tool of propaganda. Yet, after weeks of tense debate, the four powers managed to draft a common text that all could sign. The London Charter, finalized on August 8, 1945, represented not just compromise, but an unprecedented unity of purpose. It was a treaty between nations, but also a covenant with history. For the first time, the victors of war declared that even their enemies deserved judgment under law. One of the most pressing questions was where the tribunal should take place. The choice of location carried immense symbolic weight, for it would forever link the city chosen to the memory of judgment. After much discussion, Nuremberg, a city in Bavaria, was selected as the site of the trial. The decision was deliberate, for Nuremberg had been one of the great ceremonial centers of Nazi power. Its rallies, held in the vast Zeppelin field, had once showcased Hitler's vision of eternal dominance. To hold the trial there, in the heart of Nazi pageantry, would be to transform a stage of tyranny into a stage of justice. The Palace of Justice in Nuremberg was large enough to house the court, the prosecutors, the defendants, and the press. Crucially, it had survived the Allied bombing campaigns largely intact, making it one of the few suitable venues in devastated Germany. The symbolism was inescapable. Where the Nazis had proclaimed their 1,000-year Reich, they would now be condemned and unmasked before the world. Nuremberg itself became the arena where the past would be judged and the future imagined. The Palace of Justice underwent rapid transformation to accommodate the historic proceedings. Courtroom 600, the largest chamber, was remodeled to house the judges, prosecutors, and defendants, as well as the press galleries and translation booths. Because the trials would be conducted in 4 languages, English, French, German, and Russian, a new system of simultaneous interpretation was introduced. This technological innovation unprecedented in a courtroom, allowed the trial to proceed efficiently despite the language barriers. Microphones, headsets, and interpreters became as vital as the judges' gavels. Beyond the courtroom, secure cells were built for the defendants, ensuring that the men once at the pinnacle of power would be kept under constant guard. The palace became a fortress of justice, guarded by American troops, and buzzing with the energy of lawyers, clerks, journalists, and translators from across the world. Every detail, from seating arrangements to sound equipment, reflected the trial's global character. It was not merely a courtroom, but a symbol of international unity, where four great powers would speak with one voice. Nuremberg was no longer just a city. It was now a stage for history itself. The London Charter did more than create a court. It created an entirely new vision of international law. For centuries, war had been seen as the domain of kings and states, beyond the reach of judges. But now individuals could be held responsible for decisions that unleashed destruction on a planetary scale. The Charter asserted that obeying orders was not an excuse for atrocity, and that leaders could not hide behind the machinery of government. This principle, so simple and so radical, was the cornerstone of Nuremberg. It declared that the world would no longer accept mass slaughter as the prerogative of sovereign power. For soldiers, bureaucrats, and politicians alike, the message was clear: crimes against humanity would no longer be hidden behind uniforms or offices. The tribunal's creation was therefore not just a legal event but a moral revolution. It sought to bind the future with a new standard of accountability. In the ruins of war, the London Charter dared to imagine a different kind of justice, one that answered to all of humankind. By the time the Charter was signed and the Palace of Justice prepared, the stage was set for the greatest trial in history. The four powers had overcome their disagreements to forge a united vision, even as their armies still occupied a broken Germany. The categories of crimes, the selection of judges, the rules of evidence, all had been codified into a framework that would test the very limits of law. The defendants, many of whom were already in Allied custody, now knew that their fate would be decided not by firing squads, but by the judgment of an international court. The choice of Nuremberg as the venue turned the Nazi legacy back upon itself, transforming a shrine of dictatorship into a hall of accountability. The world waited with fascination and anticipation, wondering whether justice on such a scale could truly be achieved. In London and Nuremberg, history had been set in motion. The London Charter was more than a document. It was a promise. That promise was about to be tested in a courtroom unlike any other. The age of international justice was ready to begin. The London Charter did more than establish a courtroom. It created entirely new categories of criminality that had never before been tested in law. For centuries, war had been viewed as the natural domain of kings and states, beyond the judgment of judges or juries. Victors celebrated their triumphs, losers endured punishment, but seldom had leaders themselves been placed in the dock. Yet, at Nuremberg, the Allies declared that the architects of global conflict could not escape accountability. This meant defining with precision what exactly the defendants were being charged with, and under what authority. The crimes written into the Charter, crimes against peace, war crimes and crimes against humanity, were the foundation of this revolution. Each definition was the result of hours of legal debate, political maneuvering, and philosophical struggle. They were not inherited concepts, but new creations, designed to capture the scale of the Nazi catastrophe. This process of definition would become one of the most daring experiments in legal history. For in holding men accountable for acts never before judged, the tribunal was walking a line between justice and retroactive law. Crimes against peace, the first category, sought to criminalize the waging of aggressive war itself. It declared that planning, initiating, or executing a war of aggression, was no longer merely a matter of politics or statecraft, it was a crime against the community of nations. This concept drew heavily from interwar treaties, particularly the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, in which many states, including Germany, had renounced war as a tool of policy. Yet the pact had lacked enforcement, serving only as a moral statement. Nuremberg now gave it teeth, turning promises into punishable offences. This was radical, for leaders throughout history had unleashed wars without fear of legal judgment. By prosecuting German leaders for their invasion of Poland, Norway, France, and the Soviet Union, the Tribunal announced that aggressive war itself was a criminal act. Crimes against peace placed the responsibility for destruction squarely on those who orchestrated it from behind polished desks and war maps. It was an indictment not of soldiers on the battlefield, but of those who sent them there in pursuit of conquest. For the first time, launching a war was no longer glory, it was guilt. The second category, war crimes, was less novel but no less essential. Rooted in the Hague and Geneva Conventions, war crimes referred to violations of the established laws and customs of armed conflict. These included the execution of prisoners of war, the killing of hostages, the targeting of civilians, and the plundering of occupied territories. The Nazis had committed these acts on an almost unimaginable scale, from the scorched earth retreats in the east to the deliberate starvation of Soviet POWs. Unlike crimes against peace, these offences were already recognized in international law, and their prosecution rested on a firmer legal foundation. What Nuremberg added was the scope. Never before had so many instances of brutality been tied directly to the central command of a regime. Evidence showed that massacres, deportations, and wanton destruction were not random excesses but deliberate policies. The defendants could not claim ignorance, for orders bore their signatures and decrees carried their seals. War crimes brought to light the mechanics of everyday brutality, showing how the Nazi machine turned villages, towns, and entire nations into graveyards. In defining them, the Tribunal reinforced the rules of war that civilization had long held sacred. The third category, crimes against humanity, was the boldest innovation of all. Here the Tribunal moved beyond wartime conduct to confront atrocities carried out against civilian populations, including a state's own people. Murder, enslavement, deportation, and extermination, when conducted on a vast and systematic scale, were deemed to transcend national sovereignty. This definition was crafted to address the Holocaust, the deportation of millions, and the machinery of extermination that had consumed Jews, Roma, political dissidents, and countless others. For centuries, what a government did to its own citizens had been considered an internal matter, untouchable by foreign courts. Nuremberg shattered that boundary, declaring that sovereignty was no defense for genocide or mass persecution. Crimes against humanity placed human dignity above borders, ensuring that the state itself could be placed in the dock when it became a tool of destruction. Yet the concept was also controversial, for it created law where none had previously existed. Some critics feared it was too vague, too revolutionary, too retroactive, but in the shadow of Auschwitz, such objections seemed hollow. Humanity demanded a new definition, and Nuremberg delivered it. The innovation of these crimes brought with it fierce debates over retroactive justice. The principle of legality, nullum crimen sine lege, no crime without law, was deeply ingrained in legal tradition. How, the critics asked, could men be tried for crimes that had not existed when they acted? The Allies responded that these acts had always been crimes in a moral and customary sense, even if the legal framework had not yet been codified. They argued that the Nazi leaders had violated treaties, conventions, and universal standards that they knew existed, and that they could not plead ignorance of their barbarity. To allow technicalities to shield them, Jackson and his colleagues insisted would be to mock justice itself. The tribunal was not creating crimes, but giving legal form to principles already embedded in the conscience of nations. Aggressive war, atrocities against civilians, and systematic extermination were not innovations. They were outrages that demanded response. Still, the tension between retroactive law and natural justice hovered over the trial. It was a legal gamble, one that could have unraveled the proceedings, had the judges rejected the charter. Instead, they embraced it as both necessary and just. The Soviet delegation pushed particularly hard to ensure that the trials remained expansive and political, not merely narrow legal exercises. They insisted that aggression and atrocities be linked directly to the Nazi leadership, highlighting the immense suffering inflicted upon the Soviet Union. The Americans, led by Jackson, sought to ground the charges in solid legal reasoning, wary of accusations that the trials were mere victors' justice. The British sought balance, aiming to preserve due process without undermining the gravity of the crimes. The French, scarred by occupation, demanded recognition of the crimes inflicted on their civilians and deportees. Out of these divergent interests came a fragile but historic consensus. The three categories of crimes would stand as the tribunal's pillars. This compromise ensured that the trials would not collapse under political rivalry, but would proceed with unified authority. It also meant that the tribunal's judgment would resonate far beyond the courtroom, for its categories were crafted by all four powers together. The unity gave legitimacy to the definitions, even when skeptics raised doubts. At Nuremberg, law and politics fused into a single statement of human accountability. The defendants, many of whom had studied the Charter closely, immediately sensed the revolutionary danger of these definitions. Their lawyers argued that crimes against peace and crimes against humanity were vague, retroactive, and incompatible with established law. They claimed that no treaty had ever criminalized launching a war, and that no state had been tried for persecuting its own citizens. They insisted that the tribunal was applying laws written after the fact, stripping the accused of their right to a fair defense. Some went further, declaring the entire tribunal illegitimate, a puppet court of the victors, designed to humiliate the vanquished. Yet the prosecutors countered with the mountains of evidence: treaties signed, orders issued, civilians massacred, millions deported, and death camps built with bureaucratic precision. The crimes were not abstract, but painfully real, their consequences carved into the ruins of Europe. The legal innovations of the Charter, far from being arbitrary, were shaped by these tangible horrors. In the end, the defendants' protests only underscored the necessity of defining such crimes. For without them, the enormity of Nazi guilt would have slipped through the cracks of old legal codes. Thus, the London Charter's categories became the framework of Nuremberg, a fusion of law, morality, and necessity. Crimes against peace indicted the architects of aggression, ensuring that war itself was no longer beyond judgment. War crimes reaffirmed the ancient rules of conflict, reminding the world that even in battle there are limits. Crimes against humanity broke the final barrier, declaring that a state's cruelty toward its people was a matter of international concern. Together they transformed the ruins of war into the foundation of a new legal order. The debates over retroactivity and fairness were not dismissed but embraced as part of the tribunal's historic gamble. For justice to mean anything, it had to stretch beyond precedent and confront atrocities on their own scale. What emerged was not perfect law, but it was enduring law, destined to influence every human rights tribunal that followed. At Nuremberg, humanity defined its greatest crimes, and in doing so redefined itself. The crimes were named, the framework set, and the path toward justice illuminated. The next step was to bring the accused into the dock and test these definitions in the crucible of trial. The strength of the Nuremberg Trials lay not only in their bold legal definitions, but in the staggering weight of evidence amassed to support them. From the first days after Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence units and special legal teams fanned out across the ruined Reich, combing through offices, bunkers, and ministries. They discovered abandoned filing cabinets stuffed with documents, handwritten orders, and meticulous Nazi records that revealed the machinery of terror in chilling detail. Unlike most regimes that sought to hide their crimes, the Nazis had been obsessive record keepers, documenting mass deportations, extermination schedules, and lists of stolen property with bureaucratic precision. These documents, stamped with official seals and signatures, provided a damning trail that led directly to the defendants in the dock. But paper evidence was only the beginning. Vast caches of photographs and films, seized from propaganda archives, revealed with horrifying clarity the reality of ghettos, executions, and death camps. Entire warehouses brimmed with captured Nazi media, turning the Reich's own propaganda into a weapon against its creators. This transformation of the Nazis' self-image into proof of their guilt was both ironic and devastating. From the ashes of war, the Allies were building a case that no denial could survive. American prosecutor Robert H. Jackson understood that the trials needed more than legal arguments. They required irrefutable, visual, and human proof. To this end, he ordered that the evidence include films, photographs, and first-hand testimony from survivors. He wanted the courtroom not merely to hear about atrocities, but to see them with their own eyes. Among the most powerful exhibits was the film Nazi concentration camps, compiled from footage shot by Allied military photographers during the liberation of Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and other camps. Grainy reels showed bulldozers pushing piles of emaciated corpses into mass graves, while survivors, skeletal and hollow-eyed, stumbled from barbed wire enclosures. The footage left judges, prosecutors, and even hardened journalists visibly shaken. Testimonies from survivors added a human voice to the silent images, describing transports in cattle cars, selections at Auschwitz, and the constant shadow of death. These voices pierced the courtroom with the raw truth of lived experience, a truth that no legal argument could weaken. For the first time, the suffering of millions was carried directly into the heart of international justice. Gathering this evidence was no simple task. For Europe in 1945 was chaos incarnate. Cities lay in ruins, records were scattered or deliberately destroyed, and countless witnesses had either perished or vanished in the upheaval. Allied investigators established dedicated war crimes offices, often working with exhausted soldiers who doubled as translators, clerks, and guards. Teams of legal officers entered Gestapo headquarters, SS command posts, and ministries, sifting through mountains of paperwork in dimly lit ruins. Sometimes they worked against time, for looters and black marketeers sought to seize or sell valuable documents. Other times they faced resistance from locals who feared reprisals for cooperating. Still, persistence yielded extraordinary results. The discovery of the minutes from the Wannsee Conference, for example, revealed in the perpetrator's own words the cold planning of the final solution. Every discovery deepened the case, proving that the atrocities were not chaos or battlefield excesses, but deliberate policy ordered from the highest levels of government. Piece by piece, the investigators transformed fragments of destruction into a coherent, damning narrative. Captured German leaders could not escape the paper trail that bound them to their crimes. Signed decrees ordered deportations of Jews, directives approved Einsatzgruppen massacres, and memos revealed the systematic plunder of occupied lands. The meticulous accounting of stolen art, looted gold, and confiscated property tied economic exploitation directly to the Nazi leadership. Perhaps most damning were documents linking Goering, Ribbentrop-Keitel, and others to aggressive war plans, leaving no doubt about their central role. These files did not merely implicate, they convicted. Unlike oral testimony, which could be dismissed as biased, or propaganda, which could be spun, the defendant's own documents had undeniable weight. Each typed order, each initialed margin note, was a chain linking the men in the dock to the suffering of millions. When prosecutors read these documents aloud in court, the effect was chilling. Silence fell as the words of genocide echoed back against their authors. The Nazis, obsessed with record-keeping, had written their own indictments. It was as though their bureaucracy had preserved, line by line, the evidence of their guilt for history's judgment. Beyond documents, physical evidence of mass murder filled Allied warehouses. Train schedules showed the steady flow of deportees toward camps that had no return. Cyanide pellets, Zyklon B canisters, and crematorium blueprints spoke of industrialized killing. SS uniforms, marked with blood, were gathered alongside piles of victims' belongings, spectacles, shoes, children's toys, all recovered from liberated camps. These objects, ordinary in themselves, carried unbearable weight when presented in court. They showed the material reality of genocide in ways no abstract argument could convey. Witnesses wept when confronted with the belongings of the murdered, recognizing the stolen property of relatives and neighbors. Forensic teams confirmed methods of execution, testing residue from gas chambers, and analyzing burned remains. Every physical item reinforced the narrative of organized destruction, binding the courtroom not only to documents and testimony, but to tangible proof. The Holocaust and Nazi war crimes could no longer be dismissed as rumors or exaggerations. They were etched into the physical remains of Europe itself. The Allies, through relentless gathering, transformed these fragments into unshakable evidence. The task of collecting survivor testimony was equally vital and equally fraught. For many, the trauma of reliving their ordeals was nearly unbearable, yet they came forward with courage, determined to tell the world what they had endured. Survivors of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Dachau spoke of daily brutality, selections for death, and the systematic murder of families. Some broke down on the witness stand, their voices trembling as they recounted the loss of loved ones. Others, steeled by suffering, spoke with quiet determination, as though testifying was itself an act of defiance against the Nazis. These testimonies were not only evidence but moral anchors, reminding the tribunal that behind every statistic was a human life. Translators labored to capture every nuance of pain, ensuring that the voices of victims carried across the courtroom. Defense attorneys often attempted to dismiss or diminish these accounts, but the sheer consistency of survivor testimony gave it undeniable credibility. Each story reinforced the next, weaving together a tapestry of suffering and endurance. Survivor voices ensured that the trial would never lose sight of the human cost of Nazi crimes. To make sense of this vast trove of evidence, the Allies developed new methods of organization and presentation. Teams of analysts catalogued documents, numbering and cross-referencing them to create a seamless chain of proof. Film editors worked late into the night, splicing reels into coherent narratives that would devastate in court. Courtroom exhibits were carefully curated, charts of Nazi organizational structures, maps of occupied territories, and flow diagrams of deportations. Prosecutors rehearsed the order of evidence, ensuring that each exhibit built upon the last, guiding judges toward the inevitable conclusion. The case was not simply assembled. It was orchestrated with the precision of a symphony. Every detail mattered, from the placement of documents on the table to the sequencing of survivor testimony. In doing so, the Allies pioneered techniques of presenting mass atrocity evidence that would influence trials for decades. The courtroom became not only a place of law, but of historical record, where the full scope of Nazi crimes was laid bare. The presentation transformed evidence into narrative, a story of guilt told through facts and fragments. It was a narrative the defendants could not escape. By the time the trial began, the prosecution's case was monumental in both scale and gravity. Tens of thousands of documents, hundreds of films, and countless artifacts had been gathered, catalogued, and prepared. The Allies had turned chaos into clarity, gathering proof from the rubble of a destroyed Reich. The strategy was simple: overwhelm denial with fact, overwhelm excuses with evidence, and overwhelm rhetoric with reality. No one could look at the photographs, hear the survivors, or read the Nazi documents and doubt the crimes. The sheer volume of evidence crushed the defense's attempt to paint the tribunal as biased or political. What stood before the judges was not propaganda but the cold truth, preserved in ink, celluloid, and human memory. The Nazis had left behind a record too vast to deny, too damning to ignore. Building the case had been a monumental task, but it ensured that history itself would testify at Nuremberg. The courtroom was now ready, not merely to try men, but to put an entire ideology on trial. When the doors of the courtroom opened in November 1945, the world's gaze fell upon 21 men seated behind glass, guarded by American MPs. These were not nameless soldiers or obscure bureaucrats, but the architects of war, genocide, and tyranny. Each wore headphones for translation, their faces a mixture of defiance, boredom, or vacant resignation. At the front sat Hermann Goering, once Hitler's heir, still flamboyant even in captivity, his bulk diminished but his arrogance intact. Beside him was Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, who had flown to Britain on his bizarre peace mission in 1941, now a hollow shell of his former self. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister, slouched nervously, his diplomatic career reduced to ashes. Wilhelm Keitel, the field marshal who had signed Hitler's orders without protest, sat stiffly, his soldierly demeanor masking the weight of guilt. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, loomed as the highest-ranking SS officer in the dock. Around them, industrialists, propagandists, generals, and ideologues completed the grim assembly. This was the inner circle of the Reich, now stripped of uniforms and power, awaiting the judgment of history. Hermann Goering was the most prominent and commanding figure among the defendants. Once the flamboyant hero of World War I, he had risen to become Hitler's second-in-command, controlling the Luftwaffe and serving as Reichsmarschall. He was also deeply entangled in the machinery of plunder, overseeing the systematic looting of Jewish property across occupied Europe. His charisma and cunning made him the unofficial leader of the defense, often trying to dominate the courtroom through wit and bravado. Even in captivity, he attempted to charm journalists, joke with guards, and project the aura of a man still in control. Yet the evidence against him was devastating. His role in the 4-year plan tied him to forced labor, his decrees to economic exploitation, and his signatures to mass murder. Goering defended himself fiercely, portraying the trial as victor's justice, but each document and testimony unraveled his self-image. His addiction to morphine, long known, resurfaced under the strain. though he sought to conceal his weakness. Still, of all the men in the dock, Goering carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he could outwit his accusers. History, however, would render a harsher judgment than his courtroom theatrics could evade. Rudolf Hess presented a stark contrast to Goering's bluster. Once deputy Führer and guardian of the Nazi Party's internal affairs, Hess had stunned the world in 1941 by flying solo to Scotland in an attempt to negotiate peace with Britain. Now, years later, he was a broken figure, pale, gaunt, and withdrawn. During the trial, he claimed to suffer from amnesia, often appearing confused, detached, and even delusional. Prosecutors viewed his condition with skepticism, suspecting a performance meant to evade accountability. Nevertheless, his earlier role in shaping Nazi ideology and organizing the party machinery left him deeply implicated in the regime's crimes. His attempted flight had cut him off from later decisions, but his signatures on documents and his years as Hitler's deputy remained damning. Hess's strange presence in the dock symbolized both fanaticism and the absurdity of the Nazi leadership. His detachment made him one of the most enigmatic figures of the trial, a man trapped between guilt and a desperate retreat into madness. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, epitomized the diplomatic face of Nazi aggression. Once a champagne salesman turned social climber, Ribbentrop had clawed his way into Hitler's favor, negotiating alliances with fascist Italy and Imperial Japan. His most infamous achievement was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the agreement that allowed Germany to invade Poland in 1939 while securing Soviet neutrality. In court, he appeared agitated and nervous, often taking notes furiously as prosecutors laid out his role. The evidence showed that his embassies were complicit in deporting Jews from occupied territories, turning diplomacy into a weapon of mass destruction. Ribbentrop attempted to argue that he had merely followed Hitler's orders, presenting himself as a loyal but powerless servant. Yet witnesses described him as eager, ambitious, and zealous in carrying out Nazi foreign policy. His efforts to defend himself collapsed under the weight of telegrams, memos, and testimony that tied him directly to genocide. Of all the defendants, Ribbentrop seemed most haunted, as if aware that his gilded career had ended in disgrace and blood. The court saw not a statesman, but a man who addressed aggression in the garb of diplomacy. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel embodied the military obedience that sustained the Nazi war machine. As head of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, he was Hitler's chief military advisor, signing orders that facilitated crimes against civilians and prisoners of war. He authorized the infamous Commissar Order, which called for the execution of Soviet political officers, and other directives that violated international law. In the courtroom, Keitel tried to present himself as a soldier bound by duty, a man who had no choice but to obey his Führer. He wept during his testimony, portraying himself as weak, servile, and incapable of resistance. Yet prosecutors demolished this image, demonstrating that Keitel had not merely followed orders, but had actively encouraged and enforced them. His signatures appeared across countless directives that legalized brutality. His career revealed the catastrophic consequences of blind obedience when coupled with personal ambition. The field marshal, once decorated and respected, now faced judgment not for battlefield tactics, but for complicity in crimes against humanity. Keitel's downfall showed that loyalty to tyranny was no defense in the eyes of justice. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was the most senior SS officer on trial, and his towering presence made him physically imposing among the defendants. As chief of the Reich Main Security Office, he oversaw the Gestapo, the criminal police, and the SD, giving him direct responsibility for mass arrests, deportations, and executions. He was deeply implicated in the administration of concentration camps and the Einsatzgruppen massacres. Kaltenbrunner attempted to distance himself from these crimes, claiming he had little knowledge of the atrocities committed under his command. Yet documents and testimony contradicted his denials, proving he had been a central figure in implementing policies of terror. Survivors and subordinates testified to his ruthlessness, describing orders that condemned countless civilians to death. His cold demeanor in court did little to inspire sympathy, and he often appeared frustrated when confronted with evidence. Unlike some defendants who expressed regret, Kaltenbrunner remained unrepentant, clinging to denial until the end. His trial revealed the lethal efficiency of the SS apparatus, where bureaucratic order was wedded to mass murder. Kaltenbrunner represented the iron fist of the regime, cloaked in the authority of law and order. Other defendants filled the dock, each representing a different pillar of Nazi power. Alfred Rosenberg, the party's chief ideologue, had crafted the racial doctrines that justified genocide and plunder in Eastern Europe. Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland, had ruled the general government with a mixture of arrogance and brutality, overseeing ghettos and mass deportations. Julius Streicher, publisher of the anti-Semitic Rag der Stürmer, embodied the poisonous propaganda that fueled hatred and violence. Fritz Sockel, the slave driver of Europe, was responsible for the forced labor program that tore millions from their homes. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect turned armaments minister, presented himself as a technocrat who had tried to distance himself from atrocities, though his factories ran on slave labor. Karl Donitz, who succeeded Hitler briefly as head of state, defended his role in the U-boat campaign, though he tried to paint it as ordinary warfare. Each man carried his own burden of guilt, tied not to battlefield defeat, but to crimes of policy and ideology. Collectively, they represented the machinery of Nazi Germany, military, political, economic, and cultural. Their presence in the dock showed that guilt reached far beyond Hitler alone. The spectacle of these men together in one courtroom carried immense symbolic power. For the first time in history, the leaders of a defeated regime were not executed in secret or left to fade into obscurity, but confronted publicly with their deeds. The defendants sat in identical seats, their individual power erased, reduced to numbers in a docket. Some whispered to each other, others scribbled notes, but most sat in silence as their pasts were read aloud. The contrast was stark. Men who had once commanded armies, signed decrees, and shaped ideology, now powerless under the gaze of judges. The Allies wanted the world to see that justice was impartial, that even the most powerful could be held accountable. Yet the courtroom was also a theatre, where the personalities of the accused, arrogant, broken, defiant, or resigned, became part of the unfolding drama. For the audience of history, the trial offered both a reckoning and a warning. These were not abstract criminals, but flesh and blood men who had chosen evil and now faced its consequences. The dock at Nuremberg became the stage on which justice, memory, and history collided. On the cold morning of November 20th, 1945, the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg became the stage for one of the most consequential trials in human history. Inside the imposing building, the specially constructed courtroom had been fitted with translation booths, glass enclosures, and microphones, a technological marvel designed for international justice. Judges from the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France took their seats behind the elevated bench, representing the victors who now sat in judgment. At the center of the courtroom, the defendants occupied a long wooden dock enclosed by bulletproof glass, guarded at all times by military police. Journalists from across the globe packed the gallery, eager to capture every word, every gesture, every look of defiance or despair. Above, translators listened through headsets, simultaneously rendering speeches into English, French, Russian, and German, ensuring that justice would speak in 4 tongues. The room buzzed with anticipation as lawyers shuffled papers, clerks whispered to one another, and cameras flashed intermittently. Outside, lines of people waited in the winter air, desperate for a glimpse of the trial that would define the post-war world. For survivors, soldiers, and civilians alike, this day carried the weight of vindication. Humanity was about to hold its first reckoning with organized mass murder on a global scale. The defendants entered the courtroom one by one, escorted by guards, their faces betraying a mix of pride, weariness, and silent dread. Hermann Goering walked with a swagger, his presence commanding attention even stripped of uniform and rank. Rudolf Hess appeared pale and vacant, whispering to himself, his alleged amnesia making him seem almost ghost-like. Joachim von Ribbentrop avoided eye contact, his eyes darting nervously as though searching for escape. Wilhelm Keitel stood tall, but seemed to shrink under the gaze of the judges, his soldierly stiffness masking inner collapse. Ernst Kaltenbrunner's scarred face and massive frame gave him a menacing air, a reminder of the iron machinery he once controlled. Other men shuffled quietly into their places, a strange collection of faded uniforms, tailored suits, and the remnants of power. They sat side by side, bound not by loyalty, but by shared culpability, their fates now linked in history's greatest courtroom. The silence that followed their seating was heavy, a silence not of respect but of judgment waiting to be spoken. The trial had begun, and the world was watching. The opening of the trial was more than a legal procedure. It was a performance of justice, carefully staged for history. The courtroom's layout symbolized a new order. The law above, the accused below, and the press encircling all as witnesses for the ages. Cameras whirred silently in the corners, recording every moment for posterity, ensuring that the world could never deny what unfolded. Behind the judges sat national flags, reminders that this was not the tribunal of one nation, but of an alliance united by war and loss. Every detail, from the placement of microphones to the arrangement of interpreters, was chosen with deliberation. This was a trial meant to transcend language, culture, and politics, a trial that would outlive the victors themselves. For the survivors of camps and ghettos, for soldiers who had fought and bled, the symbolism was profound. It was no longer dictators and generals dictating terms. It was humanity itself sitting in judgment. The courtroom became not only a legal forum but a stage where morality and memory would be performed. The spectacle was undeniable, but its purpose was clear: to set a precedent for the world. The first voice to echo in the chamber was that of Lord Justice Geoffrey Lawrence of Britain, the tribunal's president, who called the session to order. His words, calm and formal, carried the weight of centuries of law now applied to unprecedented crimes. After him, the prosecutors introduced themselves: Justice Robert H. Jackson of the United States, Sir Hartley Shawcross of Britain, General Roman Rudenko of the Soviet Union, and François de Menthon of France. Each man embodied his nation's authority, their task not only to punish, but to prove, to demonstrate that Nazi crimes were not the invention of propaganda, but a reality carved into Europe's ruins. Jackson in particular carried immense presence, his tall figure and sharp delivery marking him as the voice of the Allies. The solemnity of the introductions was punctuated by the occasional shifting of chairs or cough in the gallery, reminders of the human nerves beneath the ceremony. In those moments, the magnitude of the trial pressed upon everyone. This was no ordinary court, no ordinary crime. The opening minutes carried a gravity that few would ever forget. Law was about to confront atrocity face to face. Robert H. Jackson rose to deliver the opening statement for the prosecution, and in that instant, the courtroom stilled into silence. His voice, deliberate and clear, carried across the chamber, echoing into history. He spoke not only as a lawyer, but as a witness to humanity's darkest hour, framing the trial as more than retribution. It was a warning for the future. Jackson declared that this tribunal was unprecedented, not in vengeance but in justice, not in conquest but in law. He described the Nazi regime as a criminal conspiracy, a planned and executed machine of aggression, enslavement, and murder. He promised that the evidence to come, documents, films, and testimonies, would show the crimes beyond doubt in the perpetrator's own words. His speech framed the trial not as the Allies judging Germany, but as civilization judging barbarism. The words resonated deeply, carried in newspapers and radio broadcasts across the globe within hours. For many listening, Jackson's statement was the moment they realized that Nuremberg was not just a trial, it was history being written. His eloquence gave voice to millions who could not speak for themselves. As Jackson spoke, the defendants reacted in varied ways, revealing their inner states. Goering listened intently, scribbling notes, and occasionally smirking as if planning his rebuttal. Ribbentrop slouched lower, his face drawn tight with anxiety, already wilting under the weight of evidence he knew would follow. Keitel blinked repeatedly, shifting uncomfortably in his chair, his soldierly mask cracking under accusations of war crimes. Hess stared blankly, seemingly detached from the words, his mind wandering in its own fog. Stryker scowled, his venomous face twisting in contempt, unable to restrain his hate, even in judgment. Speer sat quietly, his eyes fixed downward, already calculating how to distance himself from the collective guilt. Kaltenbrunner's scarred face hardened, but his fidgeting betrayed unease. The reactions became part of the trial's narrative, captured by reporters and cameras, analyzed endlessly by observers. In those moments, the courtroom became a mirror, reflecting guilt, denial, arrogance, and despair. Justice was no longer abstract, it was written on the faces of the accused. The atmosphere in the courtroom extended far beyond the walls of Nuremberg. Newspapers from London to New York, from Moscow to Paris, carried daily accounts of the proceedings, turning the trial into a global drama. Survivors of camps listened to radio reports with mixed emotions, some feeling vindication, others frustrated that justice could never match the scale of their suffering. In Germany, civilians crowded around radios, hearing for the first time details of atrocities they had long ignored or denied. The trial forced confrontation with truths too painful to dismiss, laying bare the regime's crimes in unflinching detail. International audiences marveled at the unity of the Allies, who had fought bitterly together, now cooperating in law. For historians, the trial was already recognized as a milestone, a step toward codifying international justice. Diplomats, jurists, and citizens alike understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. The opening day did not only belong to the Allies, it belonged to humanity itself. In Nuremberg, the law was reborn on the ashes of war. By the end of the opening day, the stage for months of testimony, documents, and judgment had been set. The trial was not yet about guilt or innocence, but about establishing that justice would be seen and heard. The defendants were no longer untouchable figures of authority. They were men on trial before the world. The courtroom, with its flags, judges, prosecutors, and press, became the crucible where memory and accountability would meet. Outside, night fell over Nuremberg, but inside, the echoes of Jackson's words still lingered. Reporters filed their dispatches, survivors whispered of long-awaited justice, and soldiers guarding the defendants pondered the irony of their duty. History had turned a corner, moving from destruction to reckoning. The opening trial session was not only the beginning of judgment for 21 men, but for an entire ideology. It was the moment humanity declared that even in the ruins of war, law would prevail. November 20th, 1945, would forever stand as the day the world first demanded justice on behalf of civilization itself. When the prosecution opened its case on aggressive war, the courtroom atmosphere shifted from solemn ritual to sharp confrontation with history. The Allies argued that the Nazi leadership had not stumbled into conflict, but had engineered it meticulously over years. Robert H. Jackson declared that Germany's leaders had entered into a deliberate conspiracy to dominate the world through violence and intimidation. The invasion of Poland in 1939, he insisted, was no isolated act of war, but the opening chapter in a criminal blueprint for conquest. Behind him, clerks prepared bundles of captured documents, letters, minutes, and signed directives that traced Hitler's intent with chilling clarity. Maps were displayed in the courtroom, showing Germany's military build-up and the steady expansion of its borders. The prosecution explained that these were not accidents of diplomacy, but calculated moves in a long game of domination. Every piece of evidence demonstrated foresight, intent, and cold planning. For the first time, aggressive war itself was placed on trial, defined as a crime against peace. The courtroom became the forum where international law began to confront the very concept of conquest. The invasion of Poland stood as the prosecution's first and most vivid example of aggression. On September 1st, 1939, German tanks and aircraft poured across the border in a blitzkrieg that stunned the world. Within weeks, Warsaw was reduced to rubble, its citizens subjected to terror bombings and massacres. Jackson reminded the court that this war had not been defensive, as the Nazis had claimed, but an orchestrated assault justified by lies. German radio broadcasts had falsely accused Poland of attacking first, even fabricating incidents to mask their invasion. Secret documents revealed Hitler's explicit orders to strike swiftly, to annihilate resistance, and to justify nothing. These directives showed clear premeditation, a crime carried out under the cloak of deception. Poland's suffering became the first victim of a larger plan, a plan that would consume all of Europe. Survivors' testimonies and photographs displayed the brutality unleashed from the very first day. The prosecution emphasized that the war had begun not in chaos, but in conspiracy. From Poland, the prosecution traced the chain of aggression across Europe like a spreading fire. Denmark and Norway were seized in April 1940, not for defense but to secure iron ore routes and naval advantage. The Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg, were attacked in May, swept aside in a calculated push toward France. France itself, the great Western power, fell in weeks under relentless German assault. These invasions were not spontaneous military operations, but carefully planned strikes, each documented in memoranda signed by the defendants. The prosecution laid out these records in meticulous order, showing dates, meetings, and directives that left no room for doubt. This was the essence of conspiracy, leaders sitting in conference rooms, plotting the destruction of sovereign states. The maps unfurled in the courtroom illustrated Europe like a chessboard, with Germany's moves marked in red. The Allies pointed to these charts and declared that the Nazi leadership had treated nations not as neighbors, but as pawns to be conquered. One by one, the dominoes of Europe had been pushed, always by German hands. The prosecution then turned to the Balkan campaigns, further evidence of calculated aggression. In 1941, Yugoslavia and Greece were invaded after daring to resist Hitler's demands. The courtroom heard how German divisions marched through cities, toppling governments in days. Behind the scenes, Ribbentrop and Keitel had worked hand in hand with Hitler to orchestrate these conquests, reducing independent nations to satellites. These invasions were not accidents of war, but pieces in the larger puzzle of domination. By revealing the diplomatic cables and military orders, the prosecution proved that each move was part of a conspiracy that reached far beyond borders. Documents showed that Germany's allies, Italy and Hungary, were pressured or manipulated into collaboration. The sheer speed and coordination of the campaigns demonstrated premeditation, not improvisation. For the judges, the pattern was unmistakable. War was the Nazis' chosen instrument, wielded with precision. Europe was being carved apart under a single plan. Perhaps the most staggering evidence came with the revelations about Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Launched in June 1941, it was the largest military assault in history, an act of aggression unprecedented in scale. German forces stormed across thousands of miles, burning villages and slaughtering civilians in their wake. The prosecution highlighted secret conferences where Hitler and his generals laid out the campaign months in advance. Directives ordered the complete destruction of the Soviet state, the enslavement of its people, and the elimination of political leaders. This was not merely war. It was ideological conquest fused with genocidal intent. Captured German documents referred to the Soviet population as expendable, fit only for subjugation or death. The prosecution presented orders for the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed the army, murdering Jews, commissars, and civilians in mass shootings. By tying these orders to the broader aggression, the Allies showed that war and atrocity were inseparable in Nazi plans. The invasion of the Soviet Union stood as the ultimate proof of the conspiracy for world domination. The courtroom was then shown how the Nazi conspiracy extended far beyond Europe. Jackson and his colleagues revealed Germany's alliance with Japan, the signing of the Tripartite Pact, and the coordination of global aggression. German records showed how the Axis powers plotted spheres of influence, dividing the world into empires of oppression. While Germany focused on Europe, Japan advanced in Asia, each strengthening the other's ambitions. The prosecution argued that this global vision underscored the scope of the conspiracy, a plan not just for continental conquest, but for planetary control. Diplomatic cables revealed Germany's encouragement of Japan's expansion, hoping to stretch Allied defenses across oceans. Ribbentrop's role as foreign minister was exposed, his signature on agreements that carved the world like a pie. For the court, the evidence proved that aggression was not an accident, but a coordinated international plot. The defendants were not mere soldiers caught in battle. They were architects of a global nightmare. Aggression itself had been weaponized as policy. Throughout this phase, the prosecution emphasized the human cost of aggression. Millions of civilians were displaced, cities reduced to rubble, and entire regions plunged into famine and despair. The judges were shown photographs of Warsaw's ruins, Rotterdam's smoldering streets, and the bombed cathedrals of France. Survivors' voices testified to nights of terror under sirens, to days spent burying the dead after indiscriminate attacks. Aggression was not a distant concept of law, it was lived reality, etched in scars and ruins. The prosecution argued that without these wars of aggression, the machinery of genocide and slavery could never have spread. Every conquered nation became a reservoir for forced labor, a staging ground for deportations, a site of suffering. Thus, the crime of aggression was inseparable from all that followed. The court was forced to recognize that the first crime, the launching of war, had unleashed every other atrocity. Aggressive war was the seed from which global horror grew. By the close of this segment, the prosecution had drawn a line through every act of Nazi aggression, connecting them into one coherent design, The defendants could no longer hide behind claims of military duty or political necessity. The documents, the maps, the testimonies, all revealed a conspiracy that reached into every corner of their leadership. The invasion of Poland, the collapse of France, the campaigns in the Balkans, and the drive into the Soviet Union formed a chain of deliberate acts. Each link in that chain had been forged by men now sitting in the dock. For the first time in history, leaders were being held personally accountable for the crime of waging aggressive war. The courtroom had transformed aggression from a tactic of states into a crime against humanity itself. As the judges adjourned for the day, the defendants sat in silence, the weight of the evidence pressing heavily upon them. In Nuremberg, conquest had become culpability, and the world was learning that aggression itself would never again be immune from justice. When the prosecution shifted its focus from aggressive war to war crimes, the courtroom air grew heavier as the evidence revealed suffering on a scale that defied imagination. The judges were reminded that these crimes were not committed in secret, but as official policy sanctioned by the defendants themselves. The Allies presented documents detailing orders for mass shootings of civilians, reprisal killings, and the systematic destruction of entire towns. Survivors testified to the horror of collective punishment, where German forces executed hostages for acts of resistance. Photographs of smoldering ruins, lined with the bodies of men, women, and children, were displayed as irrefutable proof. The scorched earth policies enacted during retreats showed deliberate intent to starve populations and cripple nations long after battles were lost. The prosecution emphasized that these were not the acts of undisciplined troops, but the consequences of commands given from the highest levels. Reports from the Wehrmacht itself recorded atrocities committed with precision and cold efficiency. In every occupied region, war crimes became the daily reality of life under Nazi rule. The tribunal now confronted the human face of conquest. The abuse of prisoners of war became a central pillar of the prosecution's case. Millions of captured soldiers, particularly from the Soviet Union, were subjected to starvation, exposure, and mass execution. Evidence showed that German camps were designed not merely for containment, but for slow annihilation. Entire groups of prisoners were left without shelter in freezing conditions, leading to deaths from hypothermia by the thousands. Testimonies described guards treating prisoners with brutality, beating them mercilessly, and denying them basic medical care. Documents revealed orders to deny Soviet captives the protections of the Geneva Convention, marking them as subhuman in the eyes of Nazi policy. The prosecution presented reports of shootings carried out against exhausted prisoners who could no longer march. POW camps like Stalag 352 and Ovleg 4C became symbols of suffering and despair. This pattern of neglect and deliberate killing demonstrated that the Nazi leadership had turned war captivity into a death sentence. The courtroom listened in silence as the enormity of these crimes was laid bare. The forced labor system was introduced as another cornerstone of Nazi exploitation and cruelty. Millions of civilians from occupied countries were deported into the Reich, compelled to work in factories, mines, and farms under inhuman conditions. Evidence showed that entire villages were emptied in raids, with men, women, and children herded onto trains bound for forced labor camps. Testimonies revealed endless workdays, starvation rations, and brutal punishment for the smallest acts of resistance. Families were torn apart, never to be reunited, as laborers were scattered across the German war machine. Photographs depicted skeletal workers toiling in armaments plants, guarded by armed soldiers. Documents tied these practices directly to the defendants, who had signed decrees authorizing mass deportations. The prosecution stressed that this was not economic necessity, but a deliberate policy of exploitation that reduced human beings to tools of war. By turning millions into slaves, the Nazis committed crimes that reached far beyond the battlefield. The forced labor program revealed the vast machinery of oppression beneath the surface of conquest. The scorched earth tactics employed during the German retreats in the East provided another damning example of systematic war crimes. Villages were burned to the ground, crops destroyed, and livestock slaughtered to deny resources to advancing Allied forces. Evidence showed that this destruction was carried out not only as a military strategy, but also as a weapon against civilians. Populations were left to starve, stripped of shelter as winter closed in. Survivors described wandering landscapes of ash and ruin, where only chimneys marked the places homes once stood. Military directives ordered the dismantling of entire cities, including Kiev and Smolensk, reducing them to rubble before retreat. Testimonies confirmed that civilians were often executed outright to prevent them from aiding the Allies. The tribunal heard that bridges, roads, and even wells were destroyed in a policy of total devastation. These scorched earth policies demonstrated contempt not only for the enemy but for human life itself. The prosecution argued that these crimes were designed to leave a trail of ruin as Germany's armies fell back. Hostage-taking and reprisal killings stood as another chilling category of war crimes. In occupied territories, German forces routinely executed civilians in response to acts of resistance or sabotage. Orders called for the shooting of hostages in ratios 10-50, even 100 civilians for each German soldier killed. Evidence showed how these policies were implemented in places like France, Greece, and Yugoslavia. Testimonies described public executions carried out in town squares designed to terrorize populations into submission. The prosecution presented written orders from the defendants authorizing and encouraging such collective punishments. Photographs depicted lines of men blindfolded before firing squads moments before their deaths. These crimes illustrated the calculated cruelty of Nazi occupation, where entire communities paid the price for resistance. The court recognized that such acts were not aberrations, but deliberate strategies of intimidation. In Nuremberg, the voices of the victims finally spoke through the evidence. The plunder of cultural treasures and economic resources was also presented as a war crime rooted in systematic policy. Occupied territories were stripped of art, gold, machinery, and food to enrich the Reich and weaken subject nations. Evidence revealed trains loaded with paintings, sculptures, and priceless manuscripts sent back to Germany for display or storage. Farmers in France and Ukraine were forced to surrender crops, leaving their families destitute. Factories were dismantled and transported across borders, crippling local economies. The prosecution introduced invoices, ledgers, and photographs, documenting the theft of cultural and material wealth on a massive scale. Testimonies described museum halls emptied overnight and churches desecrated for profit. This plunder was not incidental looting by soldiers, but organized policy approved by Nazi leadership. By treating occupied nations as warehouses to be emptied, Germany committed crimes against heritage and humanity alike. The tribunal recognized that war crimes extended beyond violence, reaching into the destruction of culture itself. One of the most disturbing aspects of the prosecution's case concerned crimes against medical ethics and human experimentation. Captured documents revealed the grotesque practices conducted in camps, where prisoners were subjected to experiments without consent. Testimonies described surgeries without anesthesia, deliberate infections with deadly diseases, and exposure to extreme cold or altitude to test survival. Photographs of mutilated bodies and shattered survivors shocked even seasoned observers in the courtroom. Doctors, sworn to preserve life, had turned into executioners and torturers under the Nazi regime. The prosecution emphasized that these experiments were not rogue acts, but sanctioned programs connected to the defendants' ministries. Survivors of these experiments bore scars that spoke louder than any words. The court heard how children were injected with poisons, women sterilized against their will, and men crippled in pursuit of pseudoscientific data. These crimes highlighted the perversion of medicine into an instrument of war and cruelty. The tribunal recognized them as crimes that violated the very essence of humanity. By the conclusion of this phase, the prosecution had established that Nazi war crimes spanned the breadth of occupied Europe and beyond. The evidence demonstrated a pattern of cruelty that was systemic, deliberate, and ordered from the highest levels of command. The defendants could not claim ignorance, as their signatures and directives tied them directly to atrocities. War crimes, the prosecution argued, were the inevitable consequence of aggressive conquest and occupation. From POW abuse to forced labor, from scorched earth policies to medical atrocities, the crimes painted a picture of unparalleled brutality. The tribunal was left with an overwhelming sense that these acts were not accidents of war, but its very design under Nazi rule. In Nuremberg, the stories of the victims, told through evidence and testimony, reclaimed their rightful place in history. The judges now carried the burden of recognizing war crimes as crimes under international law. The prosecution had shown that war, when waged as the Nazis had waged it, became a crime in itself. The world could never again look at conflict the same way. As the prosecution turned to crimes against humanity, the tone of the courtroom shifted from military conquest to the deliberate annihilation of entire peoples. The evidence presented was unlike anything the world had ever seen, documenting the systematic murder of millions of civilians. The prosecutors unveiled the machinery of the Holocaust, revealing extermination camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor as central instruments of genocide. The court was shown photographs of gas chambers, crematoria, and piles of human remains, stark proof of planned extermination. Einsatzgruppen reports detailed the mass shootings of Jews, Roma, and other groups, with numbers meticulously recorded in cold bureaucratic language. Survivors testified to cattle cars, crammed with the living and the dying, journeys that ended in death factories. Prosecutors emphasized that these crimes were not spontaneous acts of war, but carefully orchestrated policies. The words "final solution" became etched into the tribunal's records as a phrase that carried the weight of millions of deaths. Every shred of evidence pointed to a design for extermination carried out with precision. Crimes against humanity had become the defining horror of the Nazi regime. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, stood as the earliest architects of mass murder before the gas chambers were perfected. Their reports, seized by the Allies, listed execution tallies in the tens of thousands, sometimes recorded with chilling efficiency on a single sheet of paper. Witnesses described entire villages in Eastern Europe, lined up and shot into mass graves. Men, women, and children were forced to dig their own burial pits before being executed. Evidence showed that the victims were chosen not for any military purpose, but purely for who they were: Jews, Roma, intellectuals, and political dissidents. The tribunal heard how German officers often photographed these massacres, treating them as moments of triumph. Survivors recalled the silence after the gunfire, broken only by the cries of children buried alive. The prosecution argued that these killings were not wartime excesses, but the very heart of Nazi ideology put into action. Einsatzgruppen operations demonstrated the deliberate targeting of civilians as state policy. In Nuremberg, their cold reports condemned them beyond denial. Attention then turned to the extermination camps, which prosecutors called factories of death. Auschwitz-Birkenau, Majdanek Treblinka, Chelmno, Sobibor, and Belzec became names synonymous with mechanized killing. Photographs and films shot by liberating armies showed endless rows of barracks, gas chambers disguised as showers, and mounds of hair, shoes and glasses taken from victims. Survivors described the arrival process, where SS doctors decided with a flick of the hand who would live briefly as forced labor and who would die immediately. Testimonies detailed how Zyklon B pellets were dropped into sealed chambers, killing thousands in minutes. Crematoria worked day and night to erase the evidence, though the ashes of millions remained as silent witnesses. Documents revealed train schedules meticulously organized to bring victims from across Europe to their deaths. The prosecution presented letters and invoices, showing Zyklon B orders tied directly to SS authorities. These camps were not aberrations but core parts of the Nazi state. The tribunal faced the full horror of industrialized murder. Survivor testimony gave voice to the unspeakable, transforming statistics into human stories of suffering and survival. Witnesses like Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier described the stench of burning bodies and the cries of children torn from their mothers. Survivors told of families separated forever on railway platforms, their last glances burned into memory. Some recounted being forced into slave labor, where starvation, disease, and beatings claimed countless lives. Others testified about the grotesque medical experiments inflicted on camp prisoners, where human beings became test subjects for lethal curiosity. Each testimony carried the weight of unbearable grief, yet it was delivered with clarity to ensure the truth could not be denied. The courtroom sat in stunned silence, judges and defendants alike, unable to escape the impact of these words. The prosecution underscored that these witnesses represented only a fraction of the millions who had perished. Their voices, fragile yet unbreakable, pierced the indifference of history. At Nuremberg, the dead spoke through the living. The tribunal was also confronted with evidence of ghettos, where Jews were confined before deportation to extermination camps. Photographs revealed overcrowded streets in Warsaw, Zorgi, and Vilnius, where disease and starvation claimed lives daily. Documents showed deliberate policies to starve populations, with food rations so small that survival became mathematically impossible. Witnesses described children smuggling scraps of bread, risking death to stave off hunger. Reports detailed how entire ghettos were liquidated, their populations sent to camps in transports that meant certain death. The prosecution demonstrated that ghettos were not temporary holding areas, but integral steps in the machinery of extermination. Nazi decrees and orders left no doubt about their intended purpose. Survivors testified about the daily humiliation, brutality, and terror that defined ghetto life. The ghettos, prosecutors argued, were death sentences written in advance. They stood as another layer in the architecture of crimes against humanity. The systematic persecution extended beyond Jews. As the prosecution revealed the breadth of Nazi policies, Roma communities were hunted down and annihilated, their suffering often overlooked but no less devastating. Political opponents, clergy, and intellectuals were arrested, imprisoned, and executed. The disabled were targeted in the T4 euthanasia program, where gas chambers were first tested under the guise of mercy killing. Homosexuals, labeled with pink triangles, faced imprisonment, sterilization, and death in camps. Evidence showed that the Nazi state weaponized prejudice to eliminate all those it deemed undesirable. The tribunal learned that this persecution was driven by ideology, not military necessity. Documents and testimonies proved that these groups were marked for destruction simply because of who they were. The prosecution argued that crimes against humanity encompassed this total assault on diversity and life. It was the breadth of persecution that revealed the genocidal ambition of the regime. Films shown in the courtroom delivered perhaps the most devastating impact on all who witnessed them. The Allies had documented the liberation of camps, capturing scenes of emaciated prisoners barely clinging to life. Bulldozers pushed heaps of corpses into mass graves, the silent evidence of systematic murder. Survivors with hollow eyes stared into the camera, embodying both suffering and resilience. These images made denial impossible, for they were reality captured in stark detail. The judges watched as evidence became undeniable proof, seared into collective memory. Prosecutors emphasized that the Nazis themselves had kept records, photographs, and films, unwittingly providing evidence of their own guilt. The defendants, forced to confront these images, could not look away. For the world, these films became the unanswerable testimony of truth. Crimes against humanity were no longer abstract. They were visible, undeniable, and eternal. By the end of this phase, the prosecution had shown that crimes against humanity represented the pinnacle of Nazi criminality. Unlike war crimes tied to conflict, these atrocities targeted civilians in times of both war and occupation. They revealed a state that transformed prejudice into policy and policy into mass death. The Holocaust, ghettos, extermination camps, and Einsatzgruppen all formed one unbroken chain of destruction. Survivor voices, documents, films, and photographs wove together an irrefutable case. The tribunal was forced to grapple with horrors beyond precedent, crimes that defied the limits of language and law. Yet it was here that international justice took its boldest step, declaring such acts intolerable for all time. Crimes against humanity became a category that reshaped moral and legal thought forever. In Nuremberg, the phrase was not merely defined, it was carved into the conscience of civilization. The trial had revealed the darkest depths of human cruelty, and humanity's first attempt to hold it accountable. On December 1st, 1945, the courtroom at Nuremberg fell into a silence unlike any that had come before. The prosecution announced that it would present a documentary film compiled by the US Army Signal Corps titled Nazi Concentration Camps. For weeks the court had heard survivor testimonies, seen documents, and reviewed photographs, but now came the living images of liberation. As the lights dimmed and the projector hummed to life, judges, prosecutors, and defendants leaned forward in tense anticipation. The film opened with Allied troops entering camps like Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. Soldiers walked among skeletal prisoners who stared blankly into the lens, living shadows of humanity. Piles of corpses, bulldozers shoving them into mass graves, and crematoria still warm from recent use appeared on the screen. The courtroom, filled with hardened lawyers, generals, and diplomats, was struck dumb by the magnitude of what they saw. For the first time in history, cinema became a direct instrument of justice. Film was no longer entertainment, it was evidence. The footage unfolded slowly, methodically, as if the camera itself sought to capture every detail for posterity. Emaciated survivors clutched at liberating soldiers, their limbs little more than bone wrapped in parchment-like skin. Allied medics documented the lice-infested barracks, the hunger-ravaged bodies, and the stench of death that hung over every camp. In one sequence, heaps of corpses were shown stacked like firewood, stripped of dignity, stripped of identity. The lens lingered not for shock but for truth, forcing viewers to confront the undeniable reality. Each frame carried the power of 1,000 testimonies, unfiltered and immediate. American generals narrated portions of the film, confirming that what the world was seeing had been verified by multiple military witnesses. There was no staging, no propaganda, only the raw imprint of liberation captured in real time. In that darkened courtroom, film transformed into a witness that could not be cross-examined. It was the eye of history, unblinking and eternal. The defendants, seated in the dock, reacted in ways that revealed more than words ever could. Hermann Goering sat stone-faced, his jaw clenched tightly as if he could will the images away. Rudolf Hess muttered to himself, eyes darting between the screen and the floor. Joachim von Ribbentrop avoided looking up entirely, staring into the distance as if retreating into denial. Others, like Hans Frank, shifted uncomfortably, visibly shaken by the undeniable proof. Some attempted to maintain composure, while others showed flickers of horror or shame. The film stripped away any pretense of ignorance, demonstrating that those in power could never claim unawareness. Judges later noted the silence in the dock was as heavy as the silence in the courtroom itself. The camera did what no prosecutor's voice could achieve. It confronted the accused with the human cost of their policies. For once, denial crumbled before the gaze of truth. Beyond the courtroom, the film screening carried global significance, as newsreels later brought excerpts to audiences across the world. Civilians, who had doubted reports of Nazi atrocities, saw undeniable proof with their own eyes. For many, it was the first time they confronted the full horror of the concentration camps. Letters poured in from shocked citizens who admitted that words in newspapers had never conveyed the reality. The visual impact transcended cultural and linguistic boundaries, reaching deep into the human conscience. Diplomats present at Nuremberg sent urgent cables to their governments, describing the film as overwhelming and irrefutable. Journalists covering the trial wrote that no courtroom testimony had carried such devastating weight. The screening was described as a turning point, not only in the trial, but in world history. For once, humanity stood united in shared shock and grief. The power of film had revealed the Holocaust to the world in its starkest truth. The prosecution carefully explained how the film was compiled, ensuring its authenticity could not be challenged. US Army cameramen had been ordered to record every detail of the liberation of camps, not for propaganda, but for history. Military officers confirmed under oath that the footage was genuine, unaltered, and filmed on-site. Technical experts testified about the chain of custody of the reels, guaranteeing that what was shown in court was exactly what had been captured. These precautions were vital, as the defense attempted to dismiss the film as Allied exaggeration. Prosecutors emphasized that the Nazis themselves had often documented their crimes, and many images matched German records. The juxtaposition of Allied film and Nazi paperwork created an unbreakable chain of evidence. The Tribunal accepted the film as legitimate, setting a precedent for visual proof in legal proceedings. In doing so, Nuremberg pioneered the use of multimedia evidence in international law. The camera had become part of the judicial process. For survivors, the film held a haunting duality. It was proof of their suffering, but also a reopening of wounds. Some who testified in court wept as the images replayed what they had endured. Others watched silently, their hollow eyes reflecting memories too heavy to voice. Prosecutors described the survivors as both witnesses and living evidence, their bodies testifying alongside the screen. The film gave weight to their stories, ensuring they could never be dismissed as exaggerations. At the same time, it forced them to relive traumas they would carry for the rest of their lives. Yet many insisted on the necessity of showing the world, believing that truth, however painful, was the only safeguard against repetition. Their courage in watching, in remembering, stood as a testament to resilience. The courtroom became a space of collective mourning, where film turned into a memorial for the millions who could not speak. In that moment, justice and remembrance became inseparable. The impact of the film extended to the judges themselves. Men who had seen battlefields yet confessed to being unprepared for the images. Some later admitted that no testimony had struck them as deeply as the moving pictures. The silence that followed the screening lasted for minutes, broken only when the lights slowly rose. Chief Prosecutor Robert Jackson noted that words had always risked being dismissed as exaggeration, but film spoke with finality. He argued that future generations would see what they had seen and know it to be true. The tribunal recognized that the evidence was not only legal but moral, shaping the conscience of humanity. The images carved into memory were meant to outlast the trial itself. Judges emphasized that film had destroyed any possibility of historical doubt. What had been captured on camera was not just proof, it was legacy. Nuremberg had transformed moving pictures into eternal witnesses. By the end of the screening, the role of film in justice had been forever redefined. Nazi concentration camps was more than evidence. It was history engraved in light and shadow. It proved that some truths could not be captured by words alone, but demanded to be seen. The camera had preserved the reality of genocide in a way no denial could erase. From that day forward, film became a cornerstone in documenting crimes against humanity. Nuremberg showed the world that moving images could stand alongside testimony and documents as pillars of justice. The screening became one of the most unforgettable episodes of the trial, remembered by all who were present. Its legacy shaped future tribunals, from Rwanda to The Hague, where visual proof again played a central role. At Nuremberg, the projector illuminated not just a screen but the darkest truth of the 20th century. The lens of history had captured evil, and justice had forced the world to look. When the prosecution rested its case, the eyes of the world turned to the defendants, waiting to hear how these architects of destruction would respond. For weeks, the Allies had presented mountains of evidence, documents, testimony, films, yet the defendants still clung to hope that words might shield them from the noose. Each man in the dock knew he would be remembered not only for his crimes, but for how he attempted to justify them. Hermann Göring, the highest-ranking Nazi on trial, seized the role of de facto spokesman for the group. With defiance in his voice, he argued that the leaders of Germany had only done what any nation's leaders would do, secure their country's interests by any means necessary. He painted the Nazi leadership not as criminals, but as patriots defending their people against Bolshevism and Allied aggression. Other defendants quickly fell into familiar refrains. I was only following orders. I had no knowledge. The Führer alone was responsible. Their defenses blended self-preservation with appeals to history, legality, and duty. In the courtroom, the stage was set for a clash between evidence and excuses. What followed revealed the moral bankruptcy of men desperate to escape responsibility. The argument most frequently heard was the so-called superior orders defense, a claim that obedience absolved responsibility. Wilhelm Keitel, Field Marshal of the Wehrmacht, insisted that as head of the High Command, he could not refuse Hitler's orders. He described himself as a soldier bound by oath, unable to question directives no matter how brutal they became. In his testimony, he suggested that resistance would have meant execution and disgrace, not only for him, but for his family. Yet the prosecution had already presented documents bearing Keitel's own signature authorizing the execution of commandos and the starvation of Soviet prisoners. The contradiction between his claimed helplessness and the evidence of active participation could not be ignored. Other military leaders echoed his pleas, portraying themselves as trapped functionaries rather than architects of strategy. But their own orders showed initiative, cruelty, and zeal that exceeded mere obedience. The courtroom began to see a pattern. Submission was not the defense they claimed, but a convenient mask for complicity. Hermann Goering, ever the showman, took a more combative approach, turning his testimony into a performance. He mocked the tribunal itself, claiming it was nothing more than victor's justice imposed by the Allies. Goering argued that waging aggressive war was not illegal when Germany had acted, since no international law had explicitly outlawed it. He insisted that all major powers had engaged in wars of aggression in the past, citing Britain's empire and Russia's conquests as examples. His voice rose as he declared that Germany had simply lost a struggle for power, and that the tribunal was rewriting the rules after the fact. He attempted to cast himself as a political prisoner rather than a criminal, a scapegoat for the failures of the Reich. At moments he even turned to charm, smiling, gesturing, and speaking with theatrical energy. Yet his arrogance alienated the judges, and his rhetoric collapsed under the sheer weight of evidence. Goering's bravado could not disguise the stench of Auschwitz, Dachau, and Treblinka. His defense revealed more about his ego than any legal argument. Others adopted the stance of ignorance, claiming they had not known about the worst crimes committed under their regime. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, pleaded that his work had been confined to diplomacy, not the machinery of death. He claimed he had never been told about the systematic extermination of the Jews, nor had he realized the scope of atrocities committed in occupied territories. His words, however, were contradicted by captured memos detailing his active role in deportations. Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi ideologue, likewise claimed ignorance of mass killings, portraying himself as a philosopher caught in the tide of war. Yet prosecutors produced evidence linking him directly to the plundering of cultural treasures and the policies that enabled starvation in the East. These defenses, hinging on selective blindness, crumbled under the pressure of documented fact. The judges could see that ignorance was not innocence. It was deliberate blindness to the crimes unfolding before them. The evasions highlighted how deeply the Nazi elite had insulated themselves from accountability. In Nuremberg, those walls of denial collapsed. Some defendants attempted to shift blame entirely onto Hitler, portraying themselves as powerless instruments in the hands of the Führer. Rudolf Hess, once deputy Führer, played the role of a broken man, claiming memory loss and mental incapacity. His rambling statements gave the impression of detachment, as if he were already removed from the trial itself. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, painted himself as an administrator unable to control the excesses of the SS and Wehrmacht under his watch. He insisted that he had tried to maintain order, but in truth, millions of Jews had perished under his jurisdiction. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the Reich Security Main Office, denied direct involvement in the operations of the concentration camps, blaming subordinates and the deceased Himmler. Each defense attempted to locate guilt in someone else's hands, as if responsibility were a burden always belonging to the absent or the dead. But documents and testimony showed that each man's fingerprints were on the machinery of terror. The tribunal saw the pattern clearly. This was not submission but evasion. The defendants spoke, but their words only deepened the case against them. The defense teams, composed of German lawyers, argued passionately, but faced an impossible task. They claimed that international law had never before defined crimes against humanity or crimes against peace, accusing the tribunal of inventing new charges. They sought to prove that the Allies themselves had committed atrocities, from the bombing of Dresden to the Soviet massacre at Katyn, and therefore had no moral authority to judge. These arguments, while clever, failed to erase the reality of the crimes before the court. The judges recognized the difference between military actions in war and the industrial extermination of civilian populations. Defense lawyers also questioned the reliability of witnesses, suggesting exaggeration or Allied propaganda. Yet the film footage, the captured Nazi documents, and the survivor testimonies had already crushed doubt. What remained was an echo of technical arguments against a tide of moral evidence. The defense became less a shield and more a performance for history. And history, recorded in every transcript, was already passing judgment. Observers noted the difference in tone between the prosecution and the defense. Where the prosecution relied on methodical presentation of evidence, the defense seemed fragmented, each man clinging to a personal narrative of survival. Some, like Goering, thundered with defiance, while others, like Keitel and Ribbentrop, pleaded with visible desperation. This contrast created a surreal atmosphere in the courtroom, where truth and lies collided in dramatic fashion. The journalists covering the trial described the defense as a theater of self-justification. Some defendants hoped to shape their legacy, even if they knew the verdict would be grim. Others simply tried to buy time, stalling in the hope that the tribunal might splinter under political strain. But the Allies remained united, and the defense strategies, however varied, did little to weaken the foundation of guilt. In the end, the defendants' voices revealed their desperation more than their innocence. Their words echoed in a chamber where evidence had already spoken louder. The defense phase of the trial marked a turning point, not in favor of the accused, but in solidifying their responsibility. By speaking, the defendants revealed the hollowness of their excuses and the arrogance that had fueled their crimes. The world saw them not as tragic figures swept along by history, but as men who had wielded power and refused to accept its consequences. Their insistence on obedience, ignorance, or shifting blame only underscored how deeply the Nazi regime had corrupted morality. Judges later noted that the defendants failed to grasp the enormity of their crimes, even as they sat before history's highest court. The words they chose, the arguments they framed, and the denials they clung to became part of the record. That record would outlast them, preserved as evidence of the lengths men would go to escape accountability. In Nuremberg, their voices did not absolve them, they condemned them further. The defense had spoken, but justice was already answering back. And in the coming months the world would hear the final verdict. The courtroom atmosphere shifted when the cross-examinations began, as the prosecution seized the opportunity to dismantle the elaborate defenses crafted by the accused. Witnesses had already painted the broad picture of Nazi brutality, but now the defendants themselves faced direct and piercing interrogation. Hermann Goering, the most outspoken and theatrical of the defendants, became the centerpiece of this phase. He had delivered a performance during his defense testimony, portraying himself as a loyal patriot and skilled statesman. But under cross-examination, his mask began to slip. The prosecutors, led by Robert H. Jackson, approached with calm precision, determined to expose contradiction and arrogance. They drew attention to his signature on decrees that legalized persecution, his role in Kristallnacht, and his oversight of forced labor programs. Each question cut away the layers of his bravado, reducing his rhetoric to ashes before the court. What had begun as a performance turned into a revealing confrontation between Goering's ego and irrefutable evidence. Robert Jackson's questioning of Goering became a defining moment not only of the trial but of 20th century legal history. Jackson knew he was not only addressing the defendant, but also the millions of listeners around the world who followed the trial through radio and press. He asked Goering whether the Nazi Party's rise to power had been achieved through intimidation, coercion, and suppression of opposition. Goering, initially confident, admitted to tactics of control but attempted to justify them as necessary for national stability. Jackson pressed further, pointing out the destruction of democratic institutions and the suspension of civil liberties under Goering's leadership as president of the Reichstag. With each exchange, Goering attempted to spar, but his answers revealed the ruthless consolidation of dictatorship. Jackson's calm, methodical style contrasted with Goering's bluster, creating a striking juxtaposition. For observers, it was not a duel of equals, but a stripping away of false grandeur. The public, once intrigued by Goering's defiance, began to view him as a man cornered by truth. The cross-examination also exposed Goering's direct involvement in the persecution of Jews. When confronted with orders signed by his own hand authorizing the confiscation of Jewish property and the expulsion of Jewish citizens from economic life, Goering attempted to redirect blame onto bureaucrats. Jackson pressed him relentlessly, asking whether Goering denied the authenticity of his signature or the reality of the orders. Goering admitted the documents were genuine, but insisted he had not foreseen the extreme consequences that followed. The courtroom fell silent at such a claim, for the evidence of ghettos, deportations, and death camps had already been established. Survivors had testified to the brutality that followed such decrees, and Goering's evasions rang hollow. Each attempt to distance himself only underlined his central role in Nazi policy. The arrogance that once charmed some observers now appeared as cold indifference to suffering. His words became a noose tightening around his legacy. As the prosecutors moved from Goering to other defendants, the strategy remained consistent: expose contradictions, dismantle excuses, and force admissions. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, crumbled under questioning about his role in signing the Nazi-Soviet pact. He attempted to portray himself as a powerless diplomat, carrying out Hitler's wishes, but documents revealed he had negotiated actively and even celebrated the division of Eastern Europe. When asked about his knowledge of deportations from France and Hungary, he denied direct involvement. Prosecutors then produced telegrams in which he personally pressed ambassadors to expedite the Jewish question. His denials collapsed, and his once polished demeanor eroded into visible desperation. Unlike Goering, who fought with bluster, Ribbentrop faltered under evidence, showing the frailty of his defenses. Each contradiction became a nail in the coffin of his credibility. Observers realized that the veneer of diplomacy hid a man fully complicit in atrocity. Wilhelm Keitel's cross-examination further demonstrated how obedience could not erase responsibility. As head of the German High Command, he had signed orders that allowed the summary execution of Soviet prisoners and the Commissar order that justified mass killings. When confronted with these directives, Keitel bowed his head, admitting they bore his signature, but insisting he had merely transmitted Hitler's will. Prosecutors pressed the point: did he ever object, ever resist, ever resign in protest? Keitel admitted he had not. His justification that refusal would have meant death was met with skepticism, as other German officers had in fact opposed Hitler at great personal risk. The courtroom atmosphere grew heavier as Keitel's stoic military posture gave way to visible shame. He was forced to admit he had never attempted to mitigate the brutality of orders, only enforced them. This acknowledgement branded him not a passive soldier, but an active enabler of barbarism. His collapse under questioning marked him as a man undone by his own pen. Other defendants faced similar confrontations that destroyed their carefully built defenses. Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi ideologue, was questioned about his role in the starvation of Soviet civilians and the plundering of cultural treasures. He denied responsibility, claiming he had been concerned only with philosophical matters, but was shown memos authorizing requisitions that left millions without food. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer in the dock, insisted he had been ill and uninvolved in daily operations. Prosecutors then read orders he had approved and survivor testimonies naming him as an active overseer of terror. Hans Frank, who governed occupied Poland, wept as evidence was presented of mass deportations and massacres under his rule. Each man attempted to evade, deny, or deflect, but each was pinned down by the sheer volume of documentary proof. The confrontation phase revealed not only guilt, but also the fragility of men who once commanded nations. Under oath, their words betrayed them. For the global audience, the cross-examinations were more than legal proceedings. They were a moral reckoning. Newspapers reported daily on Goering's defiance, Keitel's shame, and Ribbentrop's collapse. Radio broadcasts transmitted the drama into homes across Europe and America, turning the trial into a worldwide spectacle. Public opinion began to shift as the world saw these once mighty leaders stripped of their aura. No longer were they untouchable figures of propaganda posters. They were men cornered, men exposed, men undone by their own hands. The courtroom's confrontations brought justice not only in the legal sense, but in the realm of perception. The myth of Nazi invincibility dissolved before microphones and cameras. Even those skeptical of the tribunal's legitimacy saw in the cross-examinations undeniable proof of complicity. Justice was not only spoken, it was performed for history. The world would not forget what was revealed on that stand. By the end of the cross-examinations, the defense had lost its momentum, and the prosecution's case stood stronger than ever. Goering's bravado, once admired by some, now seemed pathetic in light of the evidence. Ribbentrop's evasions had collapsed. Keitel's obedience was exposed as complicity, and others had been cornered into admissions they could not retract. The judges, recording every word, saw how the defendant's own testimony convicted them further. Cross-examination was not merely a legal step, it was the unmasking of an entire regime. The men who had once ruled with terror now stood as spectacles of defeat, their lies shattered in public view. Observers described it as history itself cross-examining the Third Reich. The confrontations turned the trial from a battle of arguments into a definitive revelation of guilt, and as the world listened, the weight of justice grew heavier. Nuremberg had spoken not just through evidence, but through the collapse of its defendants' own words. The tribunal's authority rested not only on its prosecutors, but on the 12 judges who sat in solemn dignity, representing 4 victorious Allied powers. Each nation had appointed 2 judges, 1 principal and 1 alternate, to ensure that no single legal tradition dominated the proceedings. From the United States came Francis Biddle, former Attorney General, and John J. Parker, a respected jurist with a reputation for balance. From Britain came Lord Geoffrey Lawrence, who would serve as presiding judge, and Sir Norman Burkitt, whose sharp intellect added weight to the bench. The Soviet Union appointed Iona Nikitchenko, a judge known for his rigid loyalty to Moscow, and Alexander Volko, who served as his alternate. France sent Henri Dondieu de Vabres, a scholar of international law, and Robert Falco, a man of judicial temperament and pragmatism. Together they formed a panel unlike any other in history, an international court created in the wake of war, tasked with defining crimes no court had previously judged. The diversity of their backgrounds ensured both tension and richness in deliberations. Their challenge was not only to weigh evidence, but to carve out principles that would shape global justice. The judges carried into Nuremberg the weight of their own traditions, each interpreting law through the lens of their nation's histories. Anglo-American jurisprudence emphasized due process, adversarial argument, and the rights of defendants, values deeply ingrained in judges like Biddle and Lawrence. The French judges drew upon civil law traditions that prized codified statutes and systematic legal reasoning, approaching the trial as a matter of principles to be articulated for the future. The Soviet judges, by contrast, operated from a system where guilt was often assumed and trials were instruments of state power, leading to a more rigid interpretation of justice. These differences were not merely academic. They shaped how the judges viewed cross-examinations, admissibility of evidence, and the interpretation of crimes. When British and American judges pressed for fairness in allowing the defense to speak fully, Soviet representatives viewed such patience as unnecessary indulgence. Yet the presence of contrasting traditions gave the tribunal legitimacy, proving it was not a single victor's tribunal, but a collective effort. Behind closed doors, debates between these legal cultures grew intense. Out of those debates, a new vision of justice was slowly formed. One of the most difficult challenges was defining the crime of aggressive war, a concept that had never before been codified in international law. Was war itself illegal, or was it only the manner in which it was waged? The judges wrestled with this philosophical dilemma, knowing that their decisions would shape precedent for generations. Francis Biddle argued that wars of conquest, waged without provocation, constituted a crime against peace, echoing the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 that renounced war as an instrument of policy. WW2 cautioned that retroactive punishment risked undermining the tribunal's credibility, for the principle of nullum crimen sine lege, no crime without law, was a cornerstone of justice. Nikitchenko, however, dismissed such concerns, declaring that Nazi aggression was so self-evident that no technicality should shield its perpetrators. Lawrence, ever the mediator, reminded his colleagues that their duty was not merely to punish, but to affirm a principle that leaders could no longer unleash destruction upon the world with impunity. These deliberations revealed the intellectual weight of the trial. It was not only about crimes committed, but about defining what humanity could no longer tolerate. Another fundamental issue was the treatment of crimes against humanity, a phrase born at Nuremberg that would come to define the 20th century's legal conscience. The judges had to determine whether systematic murder, enslavement, and persecution of civilians, even of one's own citizens, constituted an international crime. Biddle and WW2 argued passionately that sovereignty could not shield genocide, for law must protect humanity itself. Volkov and Nikitchenko, representing the Soviet bloc, supported the concept but pressed to highlight Nazi crimes against Soviet citizens above all else. Lawrence insisted that the principle must be universal, for selective justice would erode the moral foundation of the tribunal. Rosenberg's ideological tracts, Himmler's orders, and Goering's decrees made it impossible to deny that extermination had been deliberate policy. Yet it was the testimonies of survivors, corroborated by documents and photographs, that convinced even the most cautious jurists that humanity itself had been assaulted. Thus, the judges agreed to enshrine crimes against humanity as a pillar of the judgment. What began as a legal innovation became the trial's most enduring legacy. Balancing fairness with precedent-setting justice was a constant tension in the courtroom. Defense attorneys argued that the tribunal was little more than victor's justice, pointing out the absence of scrutiny for Allied actions like the bombing of Dresden or the Soviet massacre at Katyn. The judges could not ignore these accusations, for legitimacy required the appearance of impartiality. Lawrence insisted that fairness be shown, even to men whose crimes were already evident to the world. He allowed the defense wide latitude to present evidence, even when it seemed irrelevant or tedious. This decision frustrated Nikitchenko, who openly called the defense arguments a waste of time. Yet Lawrence's patience ensured that the record of the trial would withstand historical scrutiny. The contrast between measured judicial dignity and the raw accusations of the accused strengthened the tribunal's authority. Justice, the judges knew, must not only be done but be seen to be done. In this delicate balance, they carved a path that was both rigorous and fair. The personalities of the judges themselves shaped the dynamic of the tribunal. Geoffrey Lawrence, calm and dignified, commanded respect without theatrics, ensuring proceedings maintained solemnity. Francis Biddle, articulate and sharp, often clashed with Soviet judges in defense of due process. WW2 de Vabrez, scholarly and precise, was concerned with crafting a framework that would endure beyond the trial itself. Nikitchenko, by contrast, was blunt, ideological, and unwavering, at times appearing less as a jurist than as a political commissar. Behind closed doors, Burkitt often played the role of mediator, bridging philosophical divides with reasoned analysis. Falco, quieter but steady, provided balance to the French contingent, ensuring Donadue's intellectual rigor did not overshadow practical judgment. Volkov remained a shadow to Nikitchenko, rarely diverging from Moscow's line. The interplay between these men reflected the tensions of the post-war world itself, foreshadowing the Cold War divisions to come. Yet despite ideological differences, the judges remained united in their mission to hold accountable those who had plunged the world into darkness. Their unity, forged through argument, gave the tribunal strength. The weight of precedent weighed heavily on every decision. The judges were acutely aware that they were not merely writing verdicts for individual men, but establishing principles for future generations. Should leaders be personally accountable for the actions of a state? Could following orders ever excuse participation in crimes of genocide? Should sovereignty protect atrocities committed within national borders? Each of these questions cut to the heart of international law. The judges debated not only among themselves, but also within their own consciences, balancing the desire for justice against the fear of creating dangerous precedents. They sought to avoid the tribunal being seen as a political weapon, yet they knew neutrality was impossible when faced with the enormity of Nazi crimes. What emerged was not perfection but an essential foundation. Nuremberg was a beginning, not an end. Its judges accepted the burden of imperfection in order to establish a framework where none had existed before. By the close of the trial, the judges had not only passed sentences, but had reshaped the very idea of law in the modern world. Their rulings enshrined aggressive war crimes, and crimes against humanity as universal offenses, binding leaders to standards beyond national law. Critics would always question aspects of fairness, but the philosophical achievement of Nuremberg could not be undone. For the first time, power itself was held accountable to justice. In their deliberations, the judges proved that law could rise above vengeance, crafting principles meant to prevent future tyranny. Their presence in that courtroom was a symbol that civilization, even after the most brutal conflict in history, could reaffirm its moral compass. Nuremberg was both a trial of men and a trial of ideas, and the judges carried that dual responsibility with dignity. In their judgments, they wrote not only legal verdicts, but chapters of human conscience. The world would remember them not as mere arbiters of punishment, but as architects of a new order. Justice had spoken, and it spoke in the voices of 12 men from 4 nations. The autumn of 1946 carried with it an atmosphere of anticipation, as the world waited to hear the judgment on those who had orchestrated one of history's darkest chapters. After nearly a year of proceedings, thousands of pages of testimony, and evidence ranging from official documents to survivor accounts, The tribunal was ready to speak. In the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg, the air was thick with tension, for the decisions would not only determine the fate of 21 men, but also define the moral weight of international law. Crowds gathered outside, international journalists filled the press gallery, and millions followed the trial through radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines. Never before had humanity witnessed such a spectacle, where warlords, ministers, and generals were placed in the dock to answer for crimes against civilization. The defendants, some gaunt from months of confinement, others still arrogant in posture, awaited the words that would seal their destinies. The tribunal's judgment was not rushed. Every line had been carefully considered, crafted to withstand history's scrutiny. Judges carried the burden of speaking not only for themselves, but for all nations who had suffered under Nazi aggression. What was to unfold was a moment of solemn reckoning. It was justice, written in the annals of world history. On October 1st, 1946, the courtroom filled with a silence so profound it seemed to carry the weight of millions of unspoken voices. Lord Geoffrey Lawrence, the presiding judge, began the delivery of the verdicts in measured tones, his words echoing through the chamber with deliberate clarity. One by one, the names of the accused were called, each followed by a judgment that was the culmination of months of evidence and argument. Hermann Göring, once the flamboyant head of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, was found guilty on all counts: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy who had flown to Scotland in a bizarre mission in 1941, was declared guilty on 2 counts, but spared the gallows, sentenced instead to life imprisonment. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister whose diplomacy paved the way for Nazi aggression, was condemned to death. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, was found guilty of enabling the machinery of conquest and destruction, and the sentence pronounced was death. The room remained hushed, the silence broken only by the steady voice of the judge and the rustling of papers. Each verdict carried not only the weight of law, but the judgment of history. The sentences revealed a spectrum of accountability, from execution to acquittal, reflecting the tribunal's attempt to balance justice with fairness. Of the 22 major defendants originally indicted, 12 received death sentences by hanging. Among them were Keitel, Ribbentrop, Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi Party's chief ideologue, and Hans Frank, the so-called Butcher of Poland. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the Reich Main Security Office, was condemned for his role in orchestrating mass extermination. Wilhelm Frick, Minister of the Interior, was sentenced to death for his role in enforcing racial laws and facilitating deportations. Julius Streicher, the venomous publisher of Der Stürmer, whose propaganda fueled the Holocaust, was sentenced to hang for inciting genocide. Fritz Sockel, responsible for the forced labor program that dragged millions into slavery, also faced execution. Wilhelm Frick, Alfred Jodl, and Arthur Seyss-Inquart rounded out the condemned, their names forever marked as architects of Nazi crimes. The death sentences were both a legal penalty and a symbolic statement that leadership carried ultimate responsibility. Not all of the accused were condemned to death, for the tribunal carefully distinguished between levels of culpability. Rudolf Hess received life imprisonment. His bizarre persona spared the gallows, yet consigned to permanent isolation within the fortress walls of Spandau prison. Walther Funk, the Nazi Minister of Economics, was sentenced to life as well, held accountable for facilitating the financial underpinnings of the regime's crimes. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect turned armaments minister, was given 20 years in prison, his expressions of remorse seen as mitigating though not exculpatory. Konstantin von Neurath, former foreign minister, also received 15 years, his role in the early expansion of the Reich recognized as significant yet less central than others. Karl Donitz, who briefly succeeded Hitler as head of state, was sentenced to 10 years for his role in unrestricted submarine warfare. Baldur von Schirach, leader of the Hitler Youth, received 20 years, his indoctrination of German youth seen as a crime against future generations. Halimar Schacht, former Reichsbank president, was acquitted, having broken with Hitler before the war escalated. Franz von Papen, the diplomat who had enabled Hitler's rise, was also acquitted, though forever stained by association. Hans Fritzsche, a propagandist, walked free, though his freedom was met with controversy. The spectrum of punishments reflected the tribunal's effort to mete out justice proportionately. The moment when sentences were pronounced carried with it a strange mixture of solemnity and finality. Goering, ever theatrical, smirked defiantly when his death sentence was announced, projecting the same arrogance that had defined his defense. Hess sat impassive, his vacant stare betraying little emotion, as though already detached from the reality around him. Ribbentrop reportedly looked stunned, unable to comprehend that his career of polished diplomacy had led to the gallows. Keitel stood rigidly, a soldier to the end, saluting as if still obeying orders from a vanished Führer. Rosenberg sank into his chair, pale and broken, his ideological dreams reduced to ashes. Stryker shouted insults, still spewing venom, even as the judgment of death was read against him. Speer, by contrast, bowed his head, his face marked with a mixture of relief and shame, spared the gallows yet burdened with years of confinement. Some defendants accepted their fate silently, others with anger, but all knew that their power had vanished forever. The once mighty architects of tyranny were reduced to prisoners awaiting their end. Justice had spoken with a finality that none could escape. The executions themselves, carried out on October 16, 1946, were the grim punctuation mark at the end of the tribunal. 10 men were led to the gallows in the gymnasium of the Nuremberg prison, one after another, in the early hours of the morning. Goering denied the Allies the satisfaction of his hanging by committing suicide with a cyanide capsule smuggled into his cell the night before. Each of the others faced their fate with varying degrees of composure, some silent, some offering last words of defiance or faith. Ribbentrop declared his loyalty to Germany, Keitel saluted as a soldier, and Stryker shouted, "Heil Hitler," as the noose tightened. The executions were witnessed by Allied officers and journalists, ensuring transparency and preventing the emergence of myths. The bodies were cremated, their ashes scattered into a river to avoid creating sites of pilgrimage for future extremists. The world awoke to headlines announcing the final justice of Nuremberg. For the first time in history, the architects of a world war had been held personally accountable. The gallows became the ultimate symbol of justice delivered on behalf of humanity. Global reactions to the verdicts were mixed, reflecting the complexity of justice on such an unprecedented scale. In the Allied nations there was widespread satisfaction, with newspapers hailing the trial as a triumph of law over barbarism. Survivors of camps and victims' families expressed relief that the crimes had not been ignored or forgotten. Yet some critics argued that the punishments were too lenient, questioning why figures like Speter or Papen were spared. Others criticized the acquittals, fearing they would embolden future deniers of Nazi guilt. In Germany itself, the reaction was muted, with many citizens weary of war and seeking to distance themselves from the horrors of the Reich. Some still clung to denial, while others quietly acknowledged that justice had been done. In the Soviet Union, propaganda hailed the verdicts as confirmation of Nazi barbarism, while ignoring their own wartime atrocities. In neutral nations, legal scholars praised the trial's principles but debated its precedents. Across the globe, Nuremberg became a subject of reflection, controversy, and moral reckoning. Justice, it seemed, was both achieved and debated in equal measure. The verdicts of October 1946 closed a chapter, but opened a new era in international law and moral responsibility. For the first time, leaders were not shielded by the mantle of state sovereignty, but judged as individuals for crimes committed in the name of a nation. The sentences delivered in Nuremberg declared that obedience to orders was no defense when humanity itself was at stake. They also established that war crimes and crimes against humanity were not temporary inventions but enduring principles. While the gallows silenced men like Ribbentrop and Keitel, the tribunal's legacy spoke louder, shaping the Geneva Conventions, the development of the United Nations, and future international courts. Critics would forever debate aspects of fairness, but none could deny that Nuremberg had changed the very language of justice. The Palace of Justice, once a building in ruins, had become a monument to accountability. The defendants' fates became symbols of a world unwilling to return to the abyss. The judgments of 1946 echoed beyond the courtroom, reminding generations that power could no longer escape morality. Nuremberg had given humanity a new standard by which to measure justice itself. In the early hours of October 16, 1946, the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg was silent, save for the heavy footsteps of guards echoing through the prison corridors. The trials had ended, the verdicts had been delivered, and now justice awaited its final act. The condemned 10 of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany were to meet their fate at the gallows. Preparations for the executions were conducted with meticulous precision, overseen by American military authorities who sought to ensure that no flaw, no shadow of doubt, could tarnish this moment of reckoning. A temporary execution chamber had been set up in the prison gymnasium, a grim yet efficient setting chosen for its privacy and security. The nooses had been tied by Master Sergeant John C. Woods, the U.S. Army's official hangman, whose rough methods would later be scrutinized. Witnesses, including Allied officials and journalists, had been carefully selected to record the moment for posterity. Outside the walls of Nuremberg, the world waited anxiously, aware that a historic chapter was about to close. The men who once wielded armies, dictated policy, and spread terror across continents were now reduced to prisoners awaiting death. Their end would mark the symbolic burial of the regime they once served. The first to be led into the execution chamber was Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister and architect of the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. At 1:11 a.m., he was escorted from his cell, pale and visibly shaken, but still clinging to formality. When asked for final words, he declared, "God protect Germany. May I hope that this last wish of mine will be granted. My last wish is an understanding between East and West." His words were both defiant and desperate, reflecting the fractured world left in the war's wake. He mounted the gallows with trembling steps, flanked by military police, before the hood was placed over his head. The trapdoor opened with a thud, ending the life of the man who once believed diplomacy could pave the way for conquest. Observers noted the abruptness of his end, his body jerking violently as the noose snapped tight. The spectacle was unsettling, a stark reminder of how power evaporates when stripped of authority. Ribbentrop's fall was the beginning of a long night of reckoning. One by one, the architects of Nazi policy would meet the same fate. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel followed next, a soldier who had faithfully served Hitler to the bitter end. Unlike Ribbentrop, Keitel maintained rigid composure, embodying the discipline of the military he had once commanded. Standing tall in his prison uniform, He saluted before addressing his executioners. "I call on God Almighty to have mercy on the German people. I follow the order of my Führer." His words echoed the defense he had used throughout the trial, that he was merely obeying commands, even as those commands brought death to millions. At 1:20 a.m., he ascended the gallows, his face stern but calm, a soldier walking toward an inevitable end. The hood was placed over his head, the trapdoor released, and Keitel was gone, his final salute lost in the silence of the chamber. For witnesses, his death represented not only the downfall of a man, but the execution of a system that had thrived on blind obedience. A military man until his last breath, Keitel died as he had lived, under orders, even as those orders condemned him. His execution underscored the tribunal's message. Responsibility could not be shifted to superiors. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the Reich Main Security Office and one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, was next. He entered the chamber gaunt and visibly weakened by illness, his towering frame reduced by the months of imprisonment. As the highest-ranking surviving SS officer, his crimes carried the heaviest moral weight, and there was little sympathy as he was led to the gallows. When asked for his last words, Kaltenbrunner denied personal responsibility, claiming he had not been aware of the atrocities for which he was condemned. His statement rang hollow, for the evidence presented at trial had made clear his intimate role in the machinery of extermination. At 1:30 a.m., he too mounted the gallows, his legs barely steady, his voice trailing off as the hood descended. The trapdoor opened, and the man who oversaw terror and death vanished into the silence of justice. Witnesses later recalled his frailty, a stark contrast to the terror his name once evoked. His execution stood as a chilling reminder that even the most feared men could be reduced to trembling prisoners at the end. The night pressed forward, and with it, history. Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi Party's chief ideologue, followed Kaltenbrunner to the gallows. Known as the intellectual architect of Nazi racial policy, Rosenberg had long been a shadowy figure, his writings fueling the poisonous doctrines of anti-Semitism and Aryan supremacy. He approached the execution chamber with quiet resignation, saying nothing that could redeem his legacy. When asked for final words, he declined, remaining silent to the end, as if words could no longer serve him. His silence was perhaps more haunting than defiance, for it reflected the emptiness of the ideology he had championed. At 1:38 a.m., the trapdoor released, ending the life of a man whose pen had inspired genocide. Observers noted the eerie stillness of his death, as though even in his final moments he was cloaked in intellectual detachment. Rosenberg's passing carried profound symbolism, the death of an ideology that had poisoned a generation. For the tribunal, his execution was justice, not only for crimes committed, but for ideas that had corrupted millions. The noose closed on Rosenberg as surely as it closed on the lies he had spread. Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland, stepped forward next, visibly shaken and pale. Once the Governor-General of occupied Poland, he had overseen massacres, deportations, and the enslavement of millions, his name synonymous with terror in the East. Unlike Rosenberg, Frank had expressed remorse during the trial, acknowledging his guilt and seeking forgiveness. As he faced the gallows, he declared, "I am thankful for the kind treatment during my captivity, and ask God to accept me with mercy." His words contrasted sharply with the atrocities he had committed, leaving witnesses to wonder whether his repentance was genuine or simply born of desperation. At 1:45 a.m., the trapdoor fell, and Frank's life ended, leaving behind a legacy of cruelty thinly veiled by last-minute regret. For survivors of Poland, his death was a small measure of justice for the millions who never had the chance to speak. The silence that followed was heavy, as though even the execution chamber could not contain the enormity of his crimes. His hanging was one of the most symbolic, for it brought down a man who had been Hitler's viceroy in the East. Justice had found the governor who once wielded life and death with impunity. Julius Streicher, the venomous propagandist whose paper Der Stürmer incited hatred and violence, met his end with characteristic vulgarity. Unlike the others, he faced the gallows not with dignity or silence, but with outbursts of rage and fanaticism. As he entered the chamber, he shouted insults, spewing venom until the very last moment. His final words were, "Heil Hitler," screamed defiantly as the hood was placed over his head. Witnesses described the scene as grotesque, with Streicher struggling and convulsing violently after the trapdoor opened, his execution poorly carried out by Sergeant Woods. For many, this was a fitting end for a man who had lived his life spreading poison and lies. His death was not noble, not quiet, but a spectacle of hatred that persisted even in the final seconds of his existence. The chamber was left in uneasy silence after his body was removed, as though the venom he spewed lingered in the air. Streicher's hanging was justice, but also a grim reminder of the destructive power of words. The gallows silenced him, but the damage he had caused could never fully be undone. By the end of the night, 10 men had been executed, their bodies taken to crematoria, and their ashes scattered into the Isar River to prevent any chance of martyrdom. Hermann Göring, the most flamboyant of the defendants, had robbed the gallows of its prize by swallowing cyanide the night before, leaving behind a final act of defiance and cowardice. His suicide cast a shadow over the executions, yet it did not diminish their symbolic power. For the world, October 16th, 1946, marked the closing act of the first great experiment in international justice. The leaders of a regime that had unleashed unprecedented destruction and horror had faced the ultimate accountability. The gallows in Nuremberg became more than a site of death. They became a stage where history declared that no power, no ideology, and no leader could stand above justice. The executions did not heal the wounds of war, nor could they restore the millions who had perished. But they offered closure, however imperfect, to a shattered world seeking meaning after chaos. The night of October 16th became etched in memory as the moment when justice took its final step in Nuremberg. It was the symbolic burial of the Third Reich's poisoned legacy. The executions of October 16th, 1946, had closed one chapter of Nuremberg, but the story of accountability was far from over. The world recognized that justice could not end with the top political and military leaders alone, for the machinery of the Nazi state had been vast and multifaceted. Doctors, judges, corporate leaders, and administrators had enabled the crimes of the regime, giving Hitler's vision both legitimacy and logistical power. To address this, the Americans initiated 12 subsequent trials held between 1946 and 1949 in the same Palace of Justice. Unlike the International Military Tribunal, these were solely US-led proceedings carried out under the authority of Military Government Law No. 10. The goal was to hold accountable those who had been indispensable to the functioning of tyranny, men and women who had turned professions of healing, justice, and commerce into tools of destruction. Each trial revealed another dimension of complicity, showing that genocide and war crimes required not only orders from above, but active collaboration from below. The defendants were not always generals or party leaders, but bureaucrats, physicians, and businessmen in suits. Their trials challenged the idea that ordinary professionals were somehow innocent of atrocity. Justice was now extending its reach deeper into the very fabric of Nazi society. The first and perhaps most shocking of the subsequent trials was the doctor's trial, which began in December 1946. 23 physicians and medical administrators stood accused of crimes against humanity for their roles in conducting brutal experiments on concentration camp inmates. These experiments ranged from freezing studies at Dachau, where prisoners were immersed in ice water, to high-altitude decompression tests that left victims gasping for air. Others were injected with pathogens or subjected to bone, muscle, and nerve experiments without anesthesia. The defendants included prominent names such as Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, and Wolfram Sievers, head of the Einheitsbrigade. Prosecutors argued that these men had abandoned the Hippocratic Oath, turning medicine into a weapon of torture and death. Survivors testified to the agony of being treated like laboratory specimens, their bodies mutilated in the name of pseudoscience. For the first time in history, medical ethics were placed on trial in a courtroom, not just in academic debate. The outcome of the trial would give birth to the Nuremberg Code, a lasting framework for ethical standards in medical research. The doctor's trial exposed the perversion of healing into harm and underscored the necessity of binding principles for future generations. The evidence presented in the doctor's trial stunned even seasoned observers. Photographs of emaciated victims, scars from experimental surgeries, and testimony about deliberate infections painted a picture of cruelty beyond comprehension. The defense often claimed that the experiments were justified by wartime necessity, or that similar research had been conducted elsewhere. But prosecutors emphasized the complete disregard for consent, the systemic nature of the abuses, and the staggering human cost. The tribunal rejected the idea that medicine could be separated from morality, declaring that physicians bore responsibility not just to science but to humanity itself. In August 1947, verdicts were delivered, 7 were acquitted, 7 were sentenced to death, and others received prison terms. Karl Brandt and 6 others were hanged in Landsberg prison in June 1948. The Nuremberg Code that emerged emphasized voluntary consent, avoidance of unnecessary suffering, and the necessity of scientifically valid research. It would become the cornerstone of modern medical ethics, influencing policy and law worldwide. The doctor's trial thus extended justice beyond retribution. It provided a blueprint for the future, ensuring atrocities under the guise of science would never be repeated. Following the doctor's trial came the judge's trial, a chilling examination of how law itself had been weaponized under the Third Reich. 16 German jurists and officials of the Ministry of Justice were charged with implementing and enforcing Nazi racial laws, stripping citizens of rights, and legitimizing the machinery of persecution. Among them were judges who had presided over so-called People's Court proceedings, where political dissidents were condemned in sham trials. The prosecution argued that these men had turned the courts into tools of terror, where verdicts were predetermined and justice was a charade. Victims testified about being denied representation, tortured into confessions, and sentenced to death for minor offenses. The case forced the world to confront the chilling reality that even legal systems, when corrupted, can become engines of mass oppression. The defense maintained that they were simply applying the laws of their state, but the tribunal rejected this, insisting that there was a higher obligation to fundamental human rights. In December 1947, verdicts were delivered: 4 acquitted, 10 sentenced to prison terms, and 4 given life imprisonment. The judge's trial emphasized that legality did not equal morality, and that judges bore personal responsibility for enforcing unjust laws. It stood as a warning that courts must always safeguard justice, not state ideology. Equally significant were the trials of German industrialists, whose factories had fueled the Nazi war machine. The IG Farben trial, launched in 1947, brought to the dock 24 executives of the chemical conglomerate, whose products and technologies were central to the war effort. IG Farben had manufactured synthetic fuel and rubber for the Wehrmacht, and more chillingly produced Zyklon B, the gas used in extermination camps. The company had also built and operated the massive Berner-Monowitz concentration camp near Auschwitz, exploiting slave labor under inhuman conditions. Survivors described being worked to exhaustion, beaten, and left to die for the profits of a corporation. The defense argued that executives were simply serving state interests under duress, but evidence showed they had actively pursued collaboration with the regime. In 1948, 13 defendants were convicted of plunder and enslavement, though sentences were relatively light compared to the gravity of their crimes. The IG Farben case revealed how industry and ideology intertwined, proving that profit could be as destructive as politics. It highlighted that corporations were not neutral bystanders, but willing partners in atrocity. The legacy of the trial cast a shadow over business ethics that lingers to this day. The Krupp trial, held in 1947-1948, focused on Alfred Krupp and other leaders of the armaments empire that had armed Germany since the 19th century. Krupp's factories had produced tanks, artillery, and weapons that sustained Hitler's campaigns across Europe. But more damning was their reliance on forced labor, drawing tens of thousands from occupied countries, prisoners of war, and concentration camp inmates. Witnesses described brutal conditions in the Krupp plants, where malnutrition, beatings, and neglect were routine. The defense claimed the company was compelled by the Nazi state to comply, but documents showed Krupp executives had eagerly expanded their empire with slave labor. Alfred Krupp was convicted and sentenced to 12 years in prison, while several other executives received lighter sentences. However, in 1951, he was released early as part of a broader policy of leniency toward industrialists, and his fortune and factories were restored. This outcome sparked controversy, as many felt it undermined the principle of accountability. The Krupp case showed the tension between justice and post-war politics, as Cold War priorities reshaped Allied attitudes toward German industry. Still, it established a precedent that economic power carried moral responsibility. The Krupp empire survived, but its legacy was forever stained. Other subsequent trials targeted SS officials, diplomats, and administrators who had played critical roles in sustaining the Reich. These included the Ministries trial, which examined senior bureaucrats of government ministries, and the High Command trial, which scrutinized German generals accused of crimes against civilians and prisoners of war. Together, these cases broadened the scope of justice, demonstrating that responsibility extended beyond the obvious figures of power. No longer could military officers, civil servants, or corporate leaders claim immunity by hiding behind institutions. Each trial revealed another layer of complicity, another way in which ordinary roles had been corrupted to serve extraordinary evil. The cumulative effect was a comprehensive indictment of a system where every profession had been bent to the will of tyranny. Although sentences varied, and some defendants escaped with light punishments, the trials as a whole painted a damning portrait of how deeply Nazism had penetrated society. They established the principle that crimes against humanity were not isolated acts, but systemic, requiring networks of collaboration. By pursuing these cases, the Americans sought to dismantle the structures that had made dictatorship possible. The trials were not perfect, but they represented a determined attempt to root out guilt at every level. By 1949, the subsequent Nuremberg Trials had concluded, leaving behind a legacy both groundbreaking and controversial. In total, nearly 200 defendants were tried, with sentences ranging from acquittals to death. The proceedings had expanded the concept of justice, holding accountable not just the architects of policy, but the doctors, judges, and industrialists who sustained it. They emphasized that morality transcended profession, that to heal, to judge, or to produce carried with it responsibility. At the same time, political pressures, particularly the onset of the Cold War, meant that many sentences were reduced or commuted, and some convicted men later returned to positions of influence. Critics argued that this undermined the moral clarity of Nuremberg, diluting justice in favor of expediency. Yet the trials left an indelible mark on international law, human rights, and professional ethics. The Nuremberg Code, the principle that following orders is no defense, and the idea of corporate complicity in war crimes all took root here. Above all, the subsequent trials carried forward the message that accountability could not stop with leaders. It had to penetrate the very institutions that enabled tyranny. Justice, even when imperfect, had been broadened to encompass the full machinery of oppression. As the Nuremberg trials unfolded, they captured the imagination of the world, presenting themselves as a turning point in human history, where law triumphed over brute force. Yet even at the height of their moral authority, doubts lingered about whether justice was truly impartial. The phrase victor's justice circulated among critics, suggesting that the tribunal punished only the defeated while ignoring crimes committed by the victors. The defendants themselves seized on this theme, accusing the Allies of hypocrisy for prosecuting acts that, in their view, had equivalents in Allied conduct. Lawyers, philosophers, and journalists debated whether the tribunal's legitimacy was compromised by this selective application of justice. For many, the issue was not the guilt of the Nazis, whose crimes were undeniable, but whether the trial had set a precedent that law applied universally or only when convenient. This lingering question would shadow the legacy of Nuremberg, coloring interpretations for decades to come. The debate forced the world to confront the uncomfortable truth that justice in war is rarely free from politics. The lofty ideals of accountability collided with the realities of power, leaving behind a narrative that was as contested as it was groundbreaking. One of the sharpest criticisms came from the charge that the tribunal violated the principle of legality by enforcing laws retroactively. Crimes against peace, the planning and waging of aggressive war, had never before been codified as an international crime. Defendants argued that they were being punished for actions that, while immoral, were not illegal at the time they were committed. Goering, ever the sharp strategist, repeatedly pressed this argument during cross-examinations, painting the Allies as inventors of law after the fact. Legal scholars debated whether this undermined the integrity of the entire trial, since retroactive justice risked appearing more like vengeance than impartial law. Prosecutors countered that these crimes were so grave, so obvious in their immorality, that no written statute was needed to recognize their illegality. They insisted that international agreements, like the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, had already outlawed aggressive war. Still, the criticism remained potent, providing fuel for those who doubted whether the tribunal represented true justice or simply the will of the powerful. The issue underscored the tension between the pursuit of accountability and the strict boundaries of legal tradition. Soviet participation in the tribunal further complicated the image of impartial justice. The Soviet Union, though a key Allied victor, had itself engaged in acts that mirrored some of the crimes being prosecuted. The secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which carved up Eastern Europe in 1939, raised uncomfortable questions about Soviet complicity in aggression. Even more glaring was the Katyn massacre, where thousands of Polish officers had been executed by Soviet forces in 1940. During the trial, the Soviets attempted to blame this atrocity on the Germans, presenting falsified evidence to support their claim. While the tribunal ultimately sidestepped the issue, many observers saw in this episode a glaring example of selective justice. Critics argued that if Nuremberg had been consistent, Soviet leaders would have faced charges alongside their German counterparts. Instead, the crimes of one victor were concealed, while the crimes of the defeated were exposed in full detail. This imbalance became one of the central pillars of the victor's justice critique, reminding the world that even the highest ideals could be bent by the politics of alliance. The Western Allies were not immune from accusations of double standards either. The strategic bombing campaigns carried out by Britain and the United States had devastated German and Japanese cities, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. Dresden, Hamburg, and Tokyo became symbols of destruction that blurred the lines between military necessity and deliberate terror. At Nuremberg, however, such acts were never placed under scrutiny, their legality accepted without serious question. Defendants pointed to these bombings as evidence that the Allies judged only their enemies' actions, not their own. The use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki further deepened the controversy, as the unprecedented destruction raised questions about proportionality and necessity. Yet the tribunal drew a line between these actions and the systematic policies of extermination carried out by the Nazis, framing Allied bombings as part of conventional warfare. For critics, this distinction appeared hollow, reinforcing the impression of selective prosecution. By excluding Allied conduct from legal examination, Nuremberg left unresolved whether the law was truly universal. The omission haunted the tribunal's moral authority, even as it achieved its immediate goals. Another source of criticism lay in the treatment of the principle of superior orders. Many defendants argued that they had merely followed commands from higher authorities, bound by military discipline and loyalty. While the tribunal rejected this defense, insisting that individuals had a duty to disobey unlawful orders, skeptics noted the unevenness of its application. In Allied armies, soldiers were rarely punished for carrying out controversial orders, such as reprisal killings or harsh occupations. The question became whether German officers were being held to a stricter standard than their Allied counterparts. Critics argued that to criminalize obedience selectively was to distort the very concept of responsibility. Supporters of the tribunal countered that the scale and intent of Nazi crimes set them apart, making obedience no excuse. Still, the issue remained a troubling one, as it highlighted the difficulty of balancing moral duty against the realities of military life. The rejection of just following orders became a cornerstone of international law, but it was born under the shadow of accusations that it had been applied selectively. Philosophers and moral thinkers wrestled with the paradox at the heart of Nuremberg. On the one hand, the trials represented a profound moral breakthrough, an assertion that no crime was too great for accountability. On the other, they raised the enduring problem of justice administered by victors, where impartiality could never be fully guaranteed. Thinkers like Hannah Arendt warned that justice must be universal to be credible, and that selective prosecutions risked undermining their own ideals. For some, the trials were a necessary first step, imperfect but essential to establishing new norms. For others, they were irredeemably flawed, more spectacle than law, designed to cement the moral authority of the Allies rather than to deliver balanced justice. These competing interpretations ensured that Nuremberg would remain a subject of debate long after the courtroom had fallen silent. The very act of judgment had opened a new moral horizon, but also revealed the difficulty of reaching it without hypocrisy. The legacy of these debates continues to shape how we view international law today. Even within Germany, reactions to the trials reflected this ambivalence. Many Germans saw Nuremberg as an instrument of humiliation, a victor's show trial designed to demonize the defeated. Others, particularly survivors of Nazi persecution, welcomed it as a long overdue reckoning with crimes that had shattered their lives. The duality of perception meant that the trials never achieved a simple, universally accepted narrative. Instead, they became a mirror of post-war tensions, reflecting divisions both within Germany and across the world. Critics in neutral countries such as Sweden and Switzerland often echoed the theme of victor's justice, questioning why certain crimes were prosecuted and others ignored. The broader public, however, was often less concerned with legal consistency than with the revelations of Nazi horror, which overshadowed abstract debates. Still, among intellectuals and legal scholars, the charge of selective justice persisted, fueling an ongoing controversy. Nuremberg had delivered truth, but it had not delivered perfection. The perception of bias would become part of its legacy, complicating its status as a beacon of universal justice. Ultimately, the debate over victor's justice was never resolved, but it became an inseparable part of the Nuremberg story. The trials were both groundbreaking and flawed, visionary yet constrained by the politics of their time. By punishing only the defeated, they opened themselves to charges of hypocrisy, even as they laid the groundwork for future norms of accountability. Critics pointed to Soviet atrocities, Allied bombings, and retroactive law as evidence of bias, while defenders insisted that the sheer scale of Nazi crimes justified the tribunal's focus. What remained clear was that Nuremberg had created a new language of justice, even if it had not lived up to its highest aspirations. The contradictions embedded in its proceedings mirrored the contradictions of the post-war world itself. It was a world yearning for justice, but still bound by the realities of power and politics. The term victor's justice became a permanent reminder that morality and law rarely exist in isolation from history's winners and losers. Yet even with its flaws, Nuremberg stood as a crucial beginning, a first attempt to make law speak louder than vengeance. In its imperfection lay both its weakness and its enduring significance. The Nuremberg trials left behind more than a record of accountability. They provided a framework for the future of international law. For the first time, the principle was established that individuals, not just states, could be held responsible for crimes of war and humanity. This concept marked a break from centuries of military tradition, where victors wrote history and vanquished leaders were punished only politically. The idea that personal moral responsibility could override orders or state loyalty became a cornerstone of jurisprudence. Lawyers, judges, and legal scholars around the world studied the trials as a model of how justice could be enforced internationally. The trials also introduced the notion that aggressive war itself was a punishable offense, embedding it in legal doctrine for generations to come. This principle would influence treaties, conventions, and international charters for decades. What happened in the courtroom at Nuremberg did not stay confined to Germany. It echoed across capitals, universities, and tribunals worldwide. It became a turning point where humanity collectively agreed crimes so grave must never be left unpunished. The legacy was not just punitive but profoundly transformative. From the ashes of war, the trials provided the moral scaffolding for the Geneva Conventions of 1949. These conventions expanded protections for civilians, prisoners of war, and the wounded, building upon the outrage of atrocities revealed during testimony. The horrors of extermination camps, medical experiments, and mass deportations forced the world to codify protections that had long been ignored. Legal experts saw Nuremberg as both a warning and a guide, ensuring that wartime conduct would be scrutinized under universally accepted rules. The conventions forbade torture, collective punishment, and attacks on civilian populations, embedding Nuremberg's lessons into international law. Each article carried the weight of crimes once hidden, now exposed in excruciating detail. Governments ratified these conventions not out of charity, but from fear that such horrors might one day repeat. Nuremberg had shown that silence and ambiguity only aided perpetrators, and clarity in law was necessary to protect the innocent. Soldiers, commanders, and politicians alike were now bound by stricter obligations. The trials thus became the DNA of humanitarian law in the post-war world. Another monumental step came with the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Nuremberg's revelations of systematic persecution, forced labor, and racial extermination underscored the urgency of codifying fundamental rights. The declaration, spearheaded by Eleanor Roosevelt and an international committee, sought to enshrine dignity, liberty, and equality as universal principles. It was no coincidence that the timing overlapped with the aftermath of the trials, as the memory of the Holocaust haunted the drafters. The idea that every human being was entitled to rights, regardless of nationality, race, or belief, grew directly from the crimes proven at Nuremberg. Testimony of survivors and film evidence of atrocities had seared into consciousness the cost of ignoring such principles. While not legally binding, the Declaration became a moral compass, shaping constitutions, treaties, and laws worldwide. Nuremberg gave it momentum, showing what happens when humanity abandons these values. The document would not have carried such global urgency without the tribunal's unflinching exposure of Nazi brutality. It symbolized the world's determination to move from outrage to action. The International Military Tribunal also laid the groundwork for the concept of crimes against humanity, a legal category that transcended wartime conduct. Unlike war crimes, which addressed battlefield violations, crimes against humanity encompassed systematic atrocities against civilians, even in peacetime. The genocide of Jews, Roma, and others demanded a new vocabulary of law, one that recognized evil on an industrial scale. Nuremberg's judgments gave legitimacy to the idea that certain crimes offended all of humanity, not just the victims. This principle empowered international courts to prosecute perpetrators, even decades after the fact. It also made clear that sovereignty was not a shield for mass murder. Governments could no longer hide behind borders or excuses of domestic jurisdiction. Crimes of such magnitude were declared universal in their offense, requiring universal accountability. This was not just a legal shift but a philosophical one, redefining the relationship between state power and individual rights. In many ways, it was the boldest and most lasting innovation of Nuremberg. The trials also shaped the idea of permanent international justice mechanisms. Although the Cold War delayed their immediate creation, the blueprint for future courts was unmistakable. Nuremberg demonstrated that multinational judges could collaborate despite differences to deliver justice in a transparent and authoritative way. It showed that an international tribunal was not only possible, but necessary for crimes that transcended borders. In the 1990s, this legacy revived with the creation of ad hoc tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Later, the International Criminal Court (ICC) was established in The Hague, explicitly citing Nuremberg as inspiration. The ICC's authority to prosecute genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes traces directly back to the legal innovations of 1945–46. Though imperfect and contested, these courts embody the dream seeded in Nuremberg's halls. Each judgment handed down in The Hague carries a shadow of the precedent first set in Germany. The idea that justice could be international is now embedded in our global legal order. Yet Nuremberg's influence extended beyond courtrooms and treaties. It reshaped moral expectations of leadership. The defense of just following orders had been forever discredited, replaced by the doctrine of individual accountability. Political leaders, generals, and bureaucrats could no longer hide behind hierarchy when accused of atrocities. This principle filtered into military training, diplomatic norms, and political rhetoric worldwide. Governments understood that history would judge their actions not only strategically, but morally. Soldiers were told to refuse illegal orders, a radical departure from blind obedience. The tribunal's rejection of excuses created a new climate of responsibility in governance. This was not merely theory, but became practice in later conflicts, where perpetrators were hunted down and tried. Nuremberg had proved that the world would not forgive complicity, even decades after the crime. It redefined what it meant to hold power in a civilized society. Educational institutions also absorbed the lessons of Nuremberg, embedding them into law schools, history departments, and international relations programs. Generations of students studied the transcripts, examining how justice was articulated in the shadow of catastrophe. Legal textbooks carried excerpts of the judgments, treating them as foundational precedents. Historians analyzed the courtroom dynamics as a lens into the politics of the post-war world. The footage shown at the trials became part of curricula, searing the reality of atrocities into young minds. Survivors gave testimony in classrooms, ensuring that the tribunal's lessons were not forgotten. Universities worldwide made Nuremberg a case study in both law and morality. The trial became a living classroom for humanity, blending history, justice, and ethics into a single narrative. In this way, Nuremberg did not end in 1946. It continues each year as new generations confront its legacy. The pursuit of justice, they learned, is never fully complete. Ultimately, the Nuremberg trials forged a bridge between the horrors of the past and the aspirations of the future. They transformed vengeance into law, and outrage into principle. In doing so, they prevented the descent into cycles of revenge that had defined previous wars. They provided the first vocabulary for a shared global justice system. The legacy was imperfect, as later conflicts would reveal gaps and hypocrisies. But the vision they offered, a world where law restrains power, remains an enduring beacon. Every tribunal since, every convention signed, every declaration of rights owes something to Nuremberg. It stands as both a warning and a hope, a reminder of humanity's worst and a promise of its best. In the end, Nuremberg's greatest verdict was not the sentences it passed, but the principles it left behind. Those principles continue to echo, shaping our understanding of justice to this day. The memory of the Nuremberg trials is woven into the way the world remembers the Second World War itself. They provided not just an account of guilt, but a living record that forced nations to confront uncomfortable truths. The trial transcripts, photographs, and filmed evidence created an archive that continues to shape historical consciousness. Unlike wars of the past, where atrocities often dissolved into myth, Nuremberg produced documented fact. Survivors and prosecutors ensured that denial would meet a mountain of evidence too vast to dismiss. The films of concentration camps shown in court became permanent images in global memory, replayed across generations. Nuremberg, in this way, transformed memory into a weapon against forgetting. It was not merely about punishing perpetrators, but ensuring that the world could never claim ignorance again. The courtroom itself became a theatre of remembrance, where truth was performed in a way that transcended time. This deliberate preservation of memory made Nuremberg one of the most important cultural events of the 20th century. The trials also gave birth to Holocaust education, as we know it today. Survivors' testimonies, meticulously recorded, provided the foundation for museums, textbooks, and documentaries. What had once been rumors and fragmented stories became irrefutable accounts. The testimony of men and women who endured ghettos, camps, and death marches was captured in official records. These voices were amplified globally, ensuring the Holocaust could not slip into obscurity. Schools across the world incorporated lessons from Nuremberg into curricula, embedding the idea that genocide is not only a tragedy, but a warning. Memorial institutions like Yad Vashem and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum later drew heavily on Nuremberg's materials. The notion of never again found its first real voice in those courtrooms. Education became an extension of the trial itself, a process of transmitting both knowledge and moral responsibility. Through this, Nuremberg ensured that remembrance was institutionalized, not left to chance. At the same time, Nuremberg became a powerful defense against denial and revisionism. From the earliest years after the war, individuals sought to minimize or distort the crimes revealed. Holocaust denial crept into extremist politics, pamphlets, and speeches, attempting to erase or reframe history. Yet Nuremberg's detailed documentation, witness testimonies, and filmed evidence created an impenetrable shield against such distortions. Historians, journalists, and teachers could point to the court record as an authoritative refutation. Every page of transcript, every reel of film, and every sworn testimony served as a bulwark against falsehoods. In this sense, the trial's impact was not only judicial but defensive, a barrier protecting truth against deliberate lies. While deniers continued to whisper, Nuremberg ensured their claims would never carry legitimacy. The courtroom had anticipated future battles of memory, and it provided the tools to fight them. In doing so, it gave later generations a permanent arsenal against forgetting. Nuremberg also influenced the culture of memorialization that emerged in the post-war decades. Memorials to victims across Europe and beyond often cited the trial as the moment their suffering was acknowledged by the world. Plaques, statues, and commemorative ceremonies drew legitimacy from the fact that crimes had been legally proven. The names of Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka, and Bergen-Belsen, once obscure, became globally recognized through the evidence presented in court. Survivors themselves often became guides, educators, and advocates, their voices amplified by the credibility Nuremberg gave them. Commemoration days such as International Holocaust Remembrance Day trace their origins to this recognition of memory as justice. The trial had shown that remembrance was not passive but active, a form of moral resistance. Each candle lit, each museum built, each school visit stood as a continuation of the trial's legacy. In this sense, Nuremberg created a culture where memory itself became a form of justice. Its echoes can be found wherever victims of atrocity are remembered with dignity and solemnity. Beyond memorials, Nuremberg shaped the very language with which societies confront mass violence. Terms like genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes entered not only legal dictionaries, but everyday speech. They provided moral clarity, making it possible to name evil without hesitation. This vocabulary allowed survivors to articulate their pain in ways the world could understand. It gave activists tools to describe new atrocities in Cambodia, Bosnia, or Rwanda, linking them back to Nuremberg. Words became vessels of memory, carrying lessons across time and space. The courtroom thus extended into public discourse, shaping how ordinary citizens think about war, violence, and morality. This linguistic inheritance was perhaps as powerful as the legal one, ensuring atrocities could not hide behind vague language. Once named, crimes could not be ignored. The precision of Nuremberg's words became part of the collective arsenal of remembrance. The lessons of Nuremberg extended far beyond Europe, resonating in decolonizing nations, human rights movements, and struggles against dictatorship. Leaders in Asia, Africa, and Latin America studied the trials as proof that power could be held accountable. Anti-apartheid activists in South Africa pointed to Nuremberg when denouncing crimes of racial oppression. Dissidents in the Soviet bloc invoked its principles when condemning authoritarian abuses. The universality of the trial's lessons meant they could be applied to contexts far removed from Nazi Germany. Wherever people fought against tyranny, the example of Nuremberg gave them language, precedent, and moral force. The trial thus became a beacon of empowerment for those seeking justice. Its lessons were not confined to courtrooms or textbooks, but became weapons in real political struggles. Memory in this sense was both local and global, crossing boundaries with ease. Nuremberg provided a grammar of justice that transcended borders. Yet the legacy of memory also carried unresolved tensions. Critics argued that while Nuremberg established accountability for the vanquished, it ignored crimes committed by the victors. The bombing of Dresden, the atomic attacks on Japan, and Soviet atrocities in Eastern Europe remained outside the tribunal's scope. For some, this double standard undermined the universality of its lessons. Survivors of those events questioned whether their suffering was less worthy of acknowledgement. The selective memory of justice raised enduring debates about fairness and impartiality. Over time, however, Nuremberg's broader impact overshadowed these criticisms. Even if imperfect, the trial had planted seeds of accountability that grew far beyond its own limitations. Later generations sought to expand the memory of atrocities to include victims everywhere, fulfilling the promise Nuremberg had only partially achieved. The conversation about justice, fairness, and memory thus remained alive, enriched by the tribunal's precedent. In this way, its memory was both inspirational and cautionary. Ultimately, the lessons of Nuremberg lie not only in what was judged, but in what was remembered. It showed that history could be written in a courtroom, with evidence and testimony forging a permanent narrative. It demonstrated that truth, when confronted openly, could outlast denial and propaganda. It reminded humanity that remembrance is not automatic. It requires effort, vigilance, and institutions to protect it. Schools, museums, and survivors' voices ensured that memory stayed alive long after the judges departed. Nuremberg became a living warning, telling each generation this happened, and it must not happen again. Its lessons continue to echo in the face of every new atrocity, urging action rather than silence. The courtroom, once filled with the voices of perpetrators and survivors, still reverberates in global consciousness. The trial's greatest achievement was that it transformed memory into a form of justice itself. That justice remains alive wherever people remember and refuse to forget.